18. Dominance hierarchies. Any sufficiently advanced J.K. Rowling is indistinguishable from magic. That does sound like the sort of thing I would do, doesn't it? It was breakfast time on Friday morning. Harry took another huge bite out of his toast and then tried to remind his brain that scarfing his breakfast wouldn't actually get him into the dungeons any faster. Anyway, they had a full hour of study time between breakfast and the start of potions. But dungeons. In Hogwarts, Harry's imagination was already sketching the chasms, narrow bridges, torchlit sconces, and patches of glowing moss. Would there be rats? Would there be dragons? Harry Potter, said a quiet voice from behind him. Harry looked over his shoulder and found himself beholding Ernie Macmillan, smartly dressed in yellow-trimmed robes and looking a little worried. Neville thought I should warn you, Ernie said in a low voice. I think he's right. Be careful of the potions master in our session today. The older Hufflepuffs told us that Professor Snape can be really nasty to people he doesn't like, and he doesn't like most people who aren't Slytherins. If you say anything smart to him, it could be really bad for you, from what I've heard. Just keep your head down and don't give him any reason to notice you. There was a pause as Harry processed this, and then he lifted his eyebrows. Harry wished he could raise just one eyebrow, like Spock, but he'd never been able to manage. Thanks, Harry said. You might have just saved me a lot of trouble. Ernie nodded, and turned to go back to the Hufflepuff table. Harry resumed eating his toast. It was around 4 bites afterward that someone said pardon me, and Harry turned around to see an older Ravenclaw, looking a little worried. Sometime later, Harry was finishing up his 3rd plate of rashers. He'd learned to eat heavily at breakfast. He could always eat lightly at lunch if he didn't end up using the time turner. And there was yet another voice from behind him saying, Harry. Yes, Harry said wearily, I'll try not to draw Professor Snape's attention. Oh, that's hopeless, said Fred. Completely hopeless, said George. So we had the house elves bake you a cake, said Fred. We're going to put 1 candle on it for every point you lose for Ravenclaw, said George. And have a party for you at the Gryffindor table during lunch, said Fred. We hope that'll cheer you up afterward, finished George. Harry swallowed his last bite of rasher and turned around. All right, said Harry. I wasn't going to ask this after Professor Binns, I really wasn't, but if Professor Snape is that awful, why hasn't he been fired? Fired, said Fred. You mean, let go, said George. Yes, Harry said, it's what you do to bad teachers. You fire them. Then you hire a better teacher instead. You don't have unions or tenure here, right? Fred and George were frowning in much the same way that hunter-gatherer tribal elders might frown if you tried to tell them about calculus. I don't know, said Fred after a while. I never thought about that. Me neither, said George. Yeah, said Harry, I get that a lot. See you at lunch, guys, and don't blame me if there aren't any candles on that cake. Fred and George both laughed, as if Harry had said something funny, and bowed to him and headed back toward Gryffindor. Harry turned back to the breakfast table and grabbed a cupcake. His stomach already felt full, but he had a feeling this morning might use a lot of calories. As he ate his cupcake, Harry thought of the worst teacher he'd met so far, Professor Binns of history. Professor Binns was a ghost. From what Hermione had said about ghosts, it didn't seem likely that they were fully self-aware. There were no famous discoveries made by ghosts, or much of any original work, no matter who they'd been in life. Ghosts tended to have trouble remembering the current century. Hermione had said they were like accidental portraits, impressed into the surrounding matter by a burst of psychic energy accompanying a wizard's sudden death. Harry had run into some stupid teachers during his abortive forays into standard Muggle education. His father had been a lot pickier when it came to selecting grad students as tutors, of course, but history class was the first time he'd encountered a teacher who literally wasn't sentient. And it showed, too. Harry had given up after 5 minutes and started reading a textbook. When it became clear that Professor Binns wasn't going to object, Harry had also reached into his pouch and gotten earplugs. Did ghosts not require a salary? Was that it? Or was it literally impossible to fire anyone in Hogwarts even if they died? Now it seemed that Professor Snape was going about being absolutely awful to everyone who wasn't a Slytherin, and it hadn't even occurred to anyone to terminate his contract. And the headmaster had set fire to a chicken. Excuse me, came a worried voice from behind him. I swear, Harry said without turning around, this place is almost 8.5% as bad as what Dad says about Oxford. Harry stamped down the stone corridors, looking affronted, annoyed, and infuriated all at once. Dungeons. Harry hissed. Dungeons. These are not dungeons. This is a basement. A basement. Some of the Ravenclaw girls gave him odd looks. The boys were all used to him by now. It seemed that the level in which the potions classroom was located was called the dungeons for no better reason than that it was below ground and slightly colder than the main castle. In Hogwarts, Harry had been waiting his whole life, and now he was still waiting, and if there was anywhere on the face of the earth that had decent dungeons, it ought to be Hogwarts. Was Harry going to have to build his own castle if he wanted to see one little bottomless abyss? A short time later they got to the actual potions classroom and Harry cheered up considerably. The potions classroom had strange preserved creatures floating in huge jars on shelves that covered every centimeter of wall space between the closets. Harry had gotten far enough along in his reading now that he could actually identify some of the creatures, like the Zabriskan Phantma. Albeit the 50-centimeter spider looked like an Acromantula, but it was too small to be one. He'd tried asking Hermione, but she hadn't seemed very interested in looking anywhere near where he was pointing. Harry was looking at a large dust ball with eyes and feet when the assassin swept into the room. That was the first thought that crossed Harry's mind when he saw Professor Severus Snape. There was something quiet and deadly about the way the man stalked between the children's desks. His robes were unkempt, his hair spotted and greasy. There was something about him that seemed reminiscent of Lucius, although the two of them looked nothing remotely alike, and you got the impression that where Lucius would kill you with flawless elegance, this man would simply kill you. "Sit down," said Professor Severus Snape. "Now." Harry and a few other children who had been standing around talking to each other scrambled for desks. Harry had planned on ending up next to Hermione, but somehow he found himself sitting down in the nearest empty desk next to Justin Finch Fletchley. It was a doubles session, Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, which put him 2 desks to the left of Hermione. Severus seated himself behind the teacher's desk, and without the slightest transition or introduction, said, "Hannah Abbott." "Here," said Hannah in a somewhat trembling voice. "Susan Bones." "Present." And so it went, no one daring to say a word in edgewise, until. "Ah, yes. Harry Potter. Our new celebrity." "The celebrity is present, sir." Half the class flinched, and some of the smarter ones suddenly looked like they wanted to run out the door while the classroom was still there. Severus smiled in an anticipatory sort of way and called the next name on his list. Harry gave a mental sigh. That had happened way too fast for him to do anything about it. Oh well, clearly this man already didn't like him, for whatever reason. And when Harry thought about it, better by far that this potions professor should pick on him rather than, say, Neville or Hermione. Harry was a lot better able to defend himself. Yep, probably all for the best. When full attendance had been taken, Severus swept his gaze over the full class. His eyes were as empty as a night sky without stars. "You are here," Severus said in a quiet voice which the students at back strained to hear, "to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making. As there is little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, this in a rather caressing, gloating tone, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. This was just getting creepier and creepier. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop or death, if you aren't as great a pack of fools as I usually have to teach." Severus somehow seemed to notice the look of skepticism on Harry's face, or at least his eyes suddenly jumped to where Harry was sitting. "Potter," snapped the potions professor. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry blinked. "Was that in magical drafts and potions?" he said. "I just finished reading it, and I don't remember anything which used wormwood." Hermione's hand went up and Harry shot her a glare which caused her to raise her hand even higher. "Tut tut," Severus said silkily. "Fame clearly isn't everything." "Really?" Harry said. "But you just told us you'd teach us how to bottle fame. Say, how does that work, exactly? You drink it and turn into a celebrity." 3/4 of the class flinched. Hermione's hand was dropping slowly back down. Well, that wasn't surprising. She might be his rival, but she wasn't the sort of girl who would play along after it became clear that the professor was deliberately trying to humiliate him. Harry was trying hard to keep control of his temper. The first rejoinder that had crossed his mind was abracadabra. "Let's try again," said Severus. "Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "That's not in the textbook either," Harry said, "but in one Muggle book I read that a trichinobezoar is a mass of solidified hair found in a human stomach, and Muggles used to believe it would cure any poison." "Wrong," Severus said. "A bezoar is found in the stomach of a goat, it is not made of hair, and it will cure most poisons but not all." "I didn't say it would, I said that was what I read in one Muggle book." "No one here is interested in your pathetic Muggle books. Final try. What is the difference, Potter, between Monksblood and Wolfsbane?" "That did it. You know," Harry said icily, "in one of my quite fascinating Muggle books, they describe a study in which people managed to make themselves look very smart by asking questions about random facts that only they knew. Apparently the onlookers only noticed that the askers knew and the answerers didn't, and failed to adjust for the unfairness of the underlying game. So, Professor, can you tell me how many electrons are in the outermost orbital of a carbon atom?" Severus's smile widened. "4," he said. "It is a useless fact which no one should bother writing down, however. And for your information, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the draught of living death. As for monkshood and wolfsbane, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite, as you would know if you had read 1000 magical herbs and fungi. Thought you didn't need to open the book before coming, eh, Potter? All the rest of you should be copying that down so that you will not be as ignorant as him. Severus paused, looking quite pleased with himself. And that will be 5 points. No, let us make it an even 10 points from Ravenclaw for backchat. Hermione gasped, along with a number of others. Professor Severus Snape, Harry bit out. I know of nothing which I have done to earn your enmity. If there is some problem you have with me which I do not know about, I suggest we. Shut up, Potter. 10 more points from Ravenclaw. The rest of you, open your books to page 3. There was only a very faint burning sensation in the back of Harry's throat, and no moisture at all in his eyes. If crying was not an effective strategy for destroying this potion's professor, then there was no point in crying. Slowly, Harry sat up very straight. All his blood seemed to have been drained away and replaced with liquid nitrogen. He knew he'd been trying to keep his temper, but he couldn't seem to remember why. Harry, whispered Hermione frantically from 2 desks over, stop please, it's all right, we won't count it. Talking in class, Granger. 3. So, said a voice colder than 0 Kelvin, how does one go about filing a formal complaint against an abusive professor? Does one talk to the deputy headmistress, write a letter to the board of governors? Would you care to explain how it works? The class was utterly frozen. Detention for 1 month, Potter, Severus said, smiling even more broadly. I decline to recognize your authority as a teacher, and I will not serve any detention you give. People stopped breathing. Severus's smile vanished. Then you will be, his voice stopped short. Expelled, were you about to say? Harry, on the other hand, was now smiling thinly. But then you seemed to doubt your ability to carry out the threat, or fear the consequences if you did. I, on the other hand, neither doubt nor fear the prospect of finding a school with less abusive professors. Or perhaps I should hire private tutors, as is my accustomed practice, and be taught at my full learning speed. I have enough money in my vault. Something about bounties on a Dark Lord I defeated. But there are teachers at Hogwarts who I rather like, so I think it will be easier if I find some way to get rid of you instead. Get rid of me, Severus said, now also smiling thinly. What an amusing conceit. How do you suppose you will do that, Potter? I understand there have been a number of complaints about you from students and their parents, a guess but a safe one, which leaves only the question of why you're not already gone. Is Hogwarts too financially strapped to afford a real potions professor? I could chip in, if so. I'm sure they could find a better class of teacher if they offered double your current salary. 2 poles of ice radiated freezing winter across the classroom. You will find, Severus said softly, that the Board of Governors is not the slightest bit sympathetic to your offer. Lucius, Harry said, that's why you're still here. Perhaps I should chat with Lucius about that. I believe he desires to meet with me. I wonder if I have anything he wants. Hermione frantically shook her head. Harry noticed out of the corner of his eye, but his attention was all on Severus. You are a very foolish boy, Severus said. He wasn't smiling at all, now. You have nothing that Lucius values more than my friendship. And if you did, I have other allies. His voice grew hard. And I find it increasingly unlikely that you were not sorted into Slytherin. How was it that you managed to stay out of my house? Ah, yes, because the Sorting Hat claimed it was joking. For the first time in recorded history. What were you really chatting about with the Sorting Hat, Potter? Did you have something that it wanted? Harry stared into Severus's cold gaze and remembered that the Sorting Hat had warned him not to meet anyone's eyes while thinking about. Harry dropped his gaze to Severus's desk. You seem oddly reluctant to look me in the eyes, Potter. A shock of sudden understanding, so it was you the Sorting Hat was warning me about. What? Said Severus's voice, sounding genuinely surprised, though of course Harry didn't look at his face. Harry got up out of his desk. Sit down, Potter, said an angry voice from somewhere he wasn't looking. Harry ignored it, and looked around the classroom. I have no intention of letting one unprofessional teacher ruin my time at Hogwarts, Harry said with deadly calm. I think I'll take my leave of this class, and either hire a tutor to teach me potions while I'm here, or if the board is really that locked up, learn over the summer. If any of you decide that you don't care to be bullied by this man, my sessions will be open to you. Sit down, Potter. Harry strode across the room and grasped the doorknob. It didn't turn. Harry slowly turned around, and caught a glimpse of Severus smiling nastily before he remembered to look away. Open this door. No, said Severus. You are making me feel threatened, said a voice so icy it didn't sound like Harry's at all, and that is a mistake. Severus's voice laughed. What do you intend to do about it, little boy? Harry took 6 long strides forward away from the door, until he was standing near the back row of desks. Then Harry drew himself upright and raised his right hand in one terrible motion, fingers poised to snap. Neville screamed and dived under his desk. Other children shrank back or instinctively raised their arms to shield themselves. Harry, don't. shrieked Hermione. Whatever you were going to do to him, don't do it. Have you all gone mad? Barked Severus's voice. Slowly, Harry lowered his hand. I wasn't going to hurt him, Hermione, Harry said, his voice a little lower. I was just going to blow up the door. Though now that Harry remembered it, you weren't supposed to transfigure things that were to be burned, which meant that going back in time afterward and getting Fred or George to transfigure some carefully measured amount of explosives might not actually have been such a good idea. Silencio, said Severus's voice. Harry tried to say, what? And found that no sound was coming out. This has become ridiculous. I think you've been allowed to get yourself in enough trouble for one day, Potter. You are the most disruptive and unruly student I have ever seen, and I don't recall how many points Ravenclaw has right now, but I'm sure I can manage to wipe them all out. 10 points from Ravenclaw. 10 points from Ravenclaw. 10 points from Ravenclaw. 50 points from Ravenclaw. Now sit down and watch the rest of the class take their lesson. Harry put his hand into his pouch and tried to say, marker, but of course no words came out. For one brief moment that stopped him, and then it occurred to Harry to spell out MARKER using finger motions, which worked. PAD, and he had a pad of paper. Harry strode over to an empty desk, not the one he'd originally sat down in, and scrawled a brief message. He tore off that sheet of paper, put away the marker and pad in a pocket of his robes for quicker access, and held up his message, not to Snape, but to the rest of the class. I'm leaving. Does anyone else need to get out? You're insane, Potter, Severus said with cold contempt. Aside from that, no one spoke. Harry swept an ironic bow to the teacher's desk, walked over to the wall, and with one smooth motion yanked open a closet door, stepped in, and slammed the door shut behind him. There was the muffled sound of someone snapping his fingers, and then nothing. In the classroom, students looked at each other in puzzlement and fear. The potions master's face was now completely enraged. He crossed the room in terrible strides and yanked open the closet door. The closet was empty. 1 hour earlier, Harry listened from inside the closed closet. There was no sound from outside, and no point in taking risks either. CLOAK, his fingers spelled out. Once he was invisible, he very carefully and slowly cracked open the closet door and peeked out. No one seemed to be in the classroom. The door wasn't locked. It was when Harry was outside the dangerous place and inside the hallway, safely invisible, that some of the anger drained away and he realized what he'd just done. What he'd just done. Harry's invisible face was frozen in absolute horror. He'd antagonized a teacher 3 orders of magnitude beyond anything he'd ever managed before. He'd threatened to walk out of Hogwarts and might have to follow through on it. He'd lost all the points Ravenclaw had and then he'd used the time turner. His imagination showed him his parents yelling at him after he was expelled, Professor McGonagall disappointed in him, and it was just too painful and he couldn't bear it and he couldn't think of any way to save himself. The thought that Harry allowed himself to think was that if getting angry had gotten him into all this trouble, then maybe when he was angry he'd think of a way out. Things seemed clearer somehow when he was angry. And the thought that Harry didn't let himself think was that he just couldn't face this future if he wasn't angry. So he cast his thoughts back and remembered the burning humiliation. Tut tut. Fame clearly isn't everything. 10 points from Ravenclaw for backchat. The calming cold washed back through his veins like a wave reflected and returning from some breaker, and Harry let out his breath. Okay, back to being sane now. He was actually feeling a bit disappointed in his non-angry self for collapsing like that and wanting only to get out of trouble. Professor Severus Snape was everyone's problem. Normal Harry had forgotten that and wished for a way to protect himself. And let all the other victims go hang. The question wasn't how to protect himself, the question was how to destroy this potions professor. So this is my dark side, is it? Bit of a prejudiced term that, my light side seems more selfish and cowardly, not to mention confused and panicky. And now that he was thinking clearly, it was equally clear what to do next. He'd already given himself an extra hour to prepare, and could get up to 5 hours more if required. Minerva McGonagall waited in the headmaster's office. Dumbledore sat in his padded throne behind his desk, dressed in 4 layers of formal lavender robes. Minerva sat in a chair before him, opposite Severus in another chair. Facing the 3 of them was an empty wooden stool. They were waiting for Harry Potter. Harry, Minerva thought despairingly, you promised you wouldn't bite any teachers. And in her mind she could see very clearly the reply, Harry's angry face and his outraged response, I said I wouldn't bite anyone who didn't bite me first. There was a knock at the door. Come in, Dumbledore called. The door swept open, and Harry Potter entered. Minerva almost gasped out loud. The boy looked cool, collected, and utterly in control of himself. Good more, Harry's voice suddenly cut off. His jaw dropped. Minerva tracked Harry's gaze, and she saw that Harry was staring at Fawkes where the phoenix sat on its golden perch. Fawkes fluttered his bright red golden wings like the flickering of a flame, and dipped his head in a measured nod to the boy. Harry turned to stare at Dumbledore. Dumbledore winked at him. Minerva felt she was missing something. Sudden uncertainty crossed Harry's face. His coolness wavered. Fear showed in his eyes, then anger, and then the boy was calm again. A chill went down Minerva's spine. Something was not right here. Please sit down, said Dumbledore. His face was now serious once more. Harry sat. So, Harry, said Dumbledore, I've heard one report of this day from Professor Snape. Would you care to tell me what happened in your own words? Harry's gaze flicked dismissively to Severus. It's not complicated, said the boy, smiling thinly. He tried bullying me the way he's been bullying every non-Slytherin in the school since the day Lucius foisted him off on you. As for the other details, I request a private conversation with you concerning them. A student who is reporting abusive behavior from a professor can hardly be expected to speak frankly in front of that same professor, after all. This time Minerva couldn't stop herself from gasping out loud. Severus simply laughed. And the headmaster's face grew grave. Mr. Potter, the headmaster said, one does not speak of a Hogwarts professor in such terms. I fear that you labor under a terrible misapprehension. Professor Severus Snape has my fullest confidence, and serves Hogwarts at my own behest, not Lucius Malfoy's. There was silence for a few moments. When the boy spoke again, his voice was icy. Am I missing something here? Quite a number of things, Mr. Potter, said the headmaster. You should understand, to start with, that the purpose of this meeting is to discuss how to discipline you for the events of this morning. This man has terrorized your school for years. I spoke to students and collected stories to make sure there would be enough for a newspaper campaign to rally the parents against him. Some of the younger students cried while they told me. I almost cried when I heard them. You allowed this abuser to run free. You did this to your students. Why? Minerva swallowed a lump in her throat. She'd thought that sometimes, but somehow she'd never quite. Mr. Potter, said the headmaster, his voice now stern, this meeting is not about Professor Snape. It is about you and your disregard for school discipline. Professor Snape has suggested, and I have agreed, that 3 full months of detention will be appropriate. Declined, Harry said icily. Minerva was speechless. This is not a request, Mr. Potter, the headmaster said. The full, entire force of the wizard's gaze was turned on the boy. This is your punishment. You will explain to me why you allowed this man to hurt the children placed in your care, and if your explanation is not sufficient, then I will begin my newspaper campaign with you as the target. Minerva's body swayed with the force of that blow, with the sheer raw lèse-majesty. Even Severus looked shocked. That, Harry, would be most extremely unwise, Dumbledore said slowly. I am the primary piece opposing Lucius on the game board. For you to do such a thing would strengthen him greatly, and I did not think that was your chosen side. The boy was still for a long moment. This conversation grows private, Harry said. His hand flicked in Severus's direction. Send him away. Dumbledore shook his head. Harry, did I not tell you that Severus Snape has my fullest confidence? The boy's face showed the shock of it. This man's bullying makes you vulnerable. I am not the only one who could start a newspaper campaign against you. This is insane. Why are you doing this? Dumbledore sighed. I'm sorry, Harry. It has to do with things that you are not, at this time, ready to hear. The boy stared at Dumbledore. Then he turned to look at Severus. Then back to Dumbledore again. It is insanity, the boy said slowly. You haven't reined him in because you think he's part of the pattern. That Hogwarts needs an evil potions master to be a proper magical school, just as it needs a ghost to teach history. That does sound like the sort of thing I would do, doesn't it? Said Dumbledore, smiling. Unacceptable, Harry said flatly. His gaze was now cold and dark. I will not tolerate bullying or abuse. I had considered many possible ways of dealing with this problem, but I will make it simple. Either this man goes, or I do. Minerva gasped again. Something strange flickered in Severus's eyes. Now Dumbledore's gaze was also growing cold. Expulsion, Mr. Potter, is the final threat which may be used against a student. It is not customarily used as a threat by students against the headmaster. This is the best magical school in the entire world, and an education here is not an opportunity given to everyone. Are you under the impression that Hogwarts cannot get along without you? And Harry sat there, smiling thinly. Sudden horror dawned on Minerva. Surely Harry wouldn't. You forget, Harry said, that you're not the only one who can see patterns. This grows private. Now send him. Harry flicked a hand at Severus again, and then stopped in mid-sentence and mid-gesture. Minerva could see it on Harry's face, the moment when he remembered. She'd told him, after all. Mr. Potter, said the headmaster, once again, Severus Snape has my fullest confidence. You told him, whispered the boy. You utter fool. Dumbledore didn't react to the insult. Told him what? That the Dark Lord is alive. What in Merlin's name are you on about, Potter? Cried Severus in tones of sheer astonishment and outrage. Harry glanced briefly at him, smiling grimly. Oh, so we are a Slytherin, then, Harry said. I was starting to wonder. And then there was silence. Finally Dumbledore spoke. His voice was mild. Harry, what are you talking about? I'm sorry, Albus, Minerva whispered. Severus and Dumbledore turned to look at her. Professor McGonagall didn't tell me, said Harry's voice, swiftly and less calm than it had been. I guessed. I told you, I can see the patterns too. I guessed, and she controlled her reaction just as Severus did. But her control fell a shade short of perfection, and I could tell it was control, not genuine. And I told him, said Minerva, her voice trembling a little, that you, and I, and Severus were the only ones who knew. Which she did as a concession to prevent me from simply going around asking questions, as I threatened to do if she didn't talk, Harry said. The boy chuckled briefly. I really should have gotten one of you alone and told you that she told me everything, to see if you let anything slip. Probably wouldn't have worked, but would have been worth a shot. The boy smiled again. Threat's still on the table and I do expect to be briefed fully at some point. Severus was giving her a look of utter contempt. Minerva raised her chin and bore it. She knew it was deserved. Dumbledore leaned back in his padded throne. His eyes were as cold as anything Minerva had seen from him since the day his brother died. And you threaten to abandon us to Voldemort if we do not comply with your wishes. Harry's voice was razor sharp. I regret to inform you that you are not the center of the universe. I'm not threatening to walk out on magical Britain. I'm threatening to walk out on you. I am not a meek little Frodo. This is my quest and if you want and you will play by my rules. Dumbledore's face was still cold. I am beginning to doubt your suitability as the hero, Mr. Potter. Harry's return gaze was equally icy. I am beginning to doubt your suitability as my Gandalf, Mr. Dumbledore. Boromir was at least a plausible mistake. What is this Nazgul doing in my fellowship? Minerva was completely lost. She looked at Severus to see if he was following this, and she saw that Severus had turned his face away from Harry's field of vision and was smiling. I suppose, Dumbledore said slowly, that from your perspective it is a reasonable question. So, Mr. Potter, if Professor Snape is to leave you alone henceforth, will that be the last time this issue arises, or will I find you here every week with a new demand? Leave me alone. Harry's voice was outraged. I am not his only victim and certainly not the most vulnerable. Have you forgotten how defenseless children are? How much they hurt? Henceforth Severus will treat every student of Hogwarts with appropriate and professional courtesy, or you will find another potions master, or you will find another hero. Dumbledore started laughing. Full-throated, warm, humorous laughter, as if Harry had just performed a comic dance in front of him. Minerva didn't dare move. Her eyes flickered and she saw that Severus was equally motionless. Harry's visage grew even colder. You mistake me, headmaster, if you think that this is a joke. This is not a request. This is your punishment. Mr. Potter, Minerva said. She didn't even know what she was going to say. She simply couldn't let that go by. Harry made a shushing gesture at her and continued to speak to Dumbledore. And if that seems impolite to you, Harry said, his voice now a little less hard, it seemed no less impolite when you said it to me. You would not say such a thing to anyone who you considered a real human being instead of a subordinate child, and I will treat you with just the same courtesy as you treat me. Oh, indeed, in very deed, this is my punishment if ever there was one. Of course you're in here blackmailing me to save your fellow students, not to save yourself. I can't imagine why I would have thought otherwise. Dumbledore was now laughing even harder. He pounded his fist on the desk 3 times. Harry's gaze grew uncertain. His face turned toward her, addressing her for the first time. Excuse me, Harry said. His voice seemed to be wavering. Does he need to take his medication or something? Ah, Minerva had no idea what she could possibly say. Well, said Dumbledore. He wiped away tears that had formed in his eyes. Pardon me. I'm sorry for the interruption. Please continue with the blackmail. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it again. He now seemed a little unsteady. Ah, he's also to stop reading students' minds. Minerva, Severus said, his voice deadly, you. Sorting Hat warned me, said Harry. What? Can't say anything else. Anyway, I think that's it. I'm done. Silence. Now what? Minerva said, when it became apparent that no one else was going to say anything. Now what? Dumbledore echoed. Why, now the hero wins, of course. What? Said Severus, Minerva, and Harry. Well, he certainly seems to have backed us into a corner, Dumbledore said, smiling happily. But Hogwarts does need an evil potions master, or it just wouldn't be a proper magical school, now would it? So how about if Professor Snape is only awful toward students in their 5th year and higher? What? Said all 3 of them again. If it's the most vulnerable victims about whom you're concerned. Maybe you're right, Harry. Maybe I have forgotten over the decades what it's like to be a child. So let's compromise. Severus will continue to unfairly award points to Slytherin and impose lax discipline on his house, and he will be awful to non-Slytherin students in their 5th year and higher. To others he will be scary, but not abusive. He will promise to only read minds when the safety of a student requires it. Hogwarts will have its evil potions master, and the most vulnerable victims, as you put it, will be safe. Minerva McGonagall was as shocked as she'd ever been in her life. She glanced uncertainly at Severus, whose face had been left completely neutral, as though he couldn't decide what sort of expression he ought to be wearing. I suppose that is acceptable, Harry said. His voice sounded a bit odd. You can't be serious, Severus said, his voice as expressionless as his face. I am very much in favor of this, Minerva said slowly. She was so much in favor that her heart was pounding wildly beneath her robes. But what could we possibly tell the students? They might not have questioned this while Severus was being awful to everyone, but Harry can tell the other students that he discovered a terrible secret of Severus's and did a bit of blackmail, said Dumbledore. It's true, after all, he discovered that Severus was reading minds, and he certainly did blackmail us. This is insanity, exploded Severus. Bwah-ha-ha, said Dumbledore. Ah, said Harry uncertainly, and if anyone asks me why 5th years and above got shafted, I wouldn't blame them for being irate, and that part wasn't exactly my idea. Tell them, said Dumbledore, that it wasn't you who suggested the compromise, that it was all you could get. And then refuse to say anything more. That, too, is true. There's an art to it, you'll pick it up with practice. Harry nodded slowly. And the points he took from Ravenclaw? They must not be given back. It was Minerva who said it. Harry looked at her. I'm sorry, Mr. Potter, she said. She was sorry, but it had to be done. There must be some consequences for your misbehavior or this school will fall to pieces. Harry shrugged. Acceptable, he said flatly. But in the future Severus will not strike at my house connections by taking points from me, nor will he waste my valuable time with detentions. Should he feel that my behavior requires correction, he may communicate his concerns to Professor McGonagall. Harry, Minerva said, will you continue to submit to school discipline, or are you to be above the law now, as Severus was? Harry looked at her. Something warm touched his gaze, briefly before it was quashed. I will continue to be an ordinary student to every member of the staff who is not insane or evil, provided that they do not come under pressure from others who are. Harry glanced briefly at Severus, then turned back to Dumbledore. Leave Minerva alone, and I'll be a regular Hogwarts student in her presence. No special privileges or immunities. Beautiful, Dumbledore said sincerely. Spoken like a true hero. And, she said, Mr. Potter must publicly apologize for his actions of today. Harry gave her another look. This one was a bit skeptical. The discipline of the school has been gravely injured by your actions, Mr. Potter, Minerva said. It must be restored. I think, Professor McGonagall, that you considerably overestimate the importance of what you call school discipline, as compared to having history taught by a live teacher or not torturing your students. Maintaining the current status hierarchy and enforcing its rules seems ever so much more wise and moral and important when you are on the top and doing the enforcing than when you are on the bottom, and I can cite studies to this effect if required. I could go on for several hours about this point, but I will leave it at that. Minerva shook her head. Mr. Potter, you underestimate the importance of discipline because you are not in need of it yourself, she paused. That hadn't come out right, and Severus, Dumbledore, and even Harry were giving her strange looks. To learn, I mean. Not every child can learn in the absence of authority. And it is the other children who will be hurt, Mr. Potter, if they see your example as one to be followed. Harry's lips curved into a twisted smile. The first and last resort is the truth. The truth is that I shouldn't have gotten angry, I shouldn't have disrupted the class, I shouldn't have done what I did, and I set a bad example for everyone. The truth is also that Severus Snape behaved in a fashion unbecoming a Hogwarts professor, and that from now on he will be more mindful of the injured feelings of students in their 4th year and under. The two of us could both get up and speak the truth. I could live with that. In your dreams, Potter. Spat Severus. After all, said Harry, smiling grimly, if the students see that rules are for everyone. For professors too, not just for poor helpless students who get nothing but suffering out of the system. Why, the positive effects on school discipline should be tremendous. There was a brief pause, and then Dumbledore chuckled. Minerva is thinking that you're righter than you have any right to be. Harry's gaze jerked away from Dumbledore, down to the floor. Are you reading her mind? Common sense is often mistaken for legilimency, said Dumbledore. I shall talk over this matter with Severus, and no apology will be required from you unless he apologizes as well. And now I declare this matter concluded, at least until lunchtime. He paused. Although, Harry, I'm afraid that Minerva wished to speak with you about an additional matter. And that is not the result of any pressure on my part. Minerva, if you would. Minerva rose from her chair and almost fell. There was too much adrenaline in her blood, her heart was beating too fast. Fox, said Dumbledore, accompany her, please. I don't, she started to say. Dumbledore shot her a look, and she fell silent. The phoenix soared across the room like a smooth tongue of flame leaping out, and landed on her shoulder. She felt the warmth through her robes, all through her body. Please follow me, Mr. Potter, she said, firmly now, and they left through the door. They stood on the rotating stairs, descending in silence. Minerva didn't know what to say. She didn't know this person who stood beside her. And Fawkes began to croon. It was tender and soft, like a fireplace would sound if it had melody, and it washed over Minerva's mind, easing, soothing, gentling what it touched. What is that? Harry whispered beside her. His voice was unstable, wobbling, changing pitch. The Song of the Phoenix, said Minerva, not really aware of what she was saying. Her attention was all on that strange quiet music. It too heals. Harry turned his face from her, but she caught a glimpse of something agonized. The descent seemed to take a very long time, or maybe it was only that the music seemed to take a very long time, and when they stepped out through the gap where a gargoyle had been, she was holding Harry's hand firmly in hers. As the gargoyle stepped back into place, Fawkes left her shoulder, and swooped to hover in front of Harry. Harry stared at Fawkes like someone hypnotized by the ever-changing light of a fire. What am I to do, Fawkes? Whispered Harry. I couldn't have protected them if I hadn't been angry. The phoenix's wings continued flapping, it continued hovering in place. There was no sound but the beating of the wings. Then there was a flash like a fire flaring up and going out, and Fawkes was gone. Both of them blinked, like waking up from a dream, or maybe like falling asleep again. Minerva looked down. Harry Potter's bright young face looked up at her. Are phoenixes people? Said Harry. I mean, are they smart enough to count as people? Could I talk with Fawkes if I knew how? Minerva blinked hard. Then she blinked again. No, Minerva said, her voice wavering. Phoenixes are creatures of powerful magic. That magic gives their existence a weight of meaning which no simple animal could possess. They are fire, light, healing, rebirth. But in the end, no. Where can I get one? Minerva leaned down and hugged him. She hadn't meant to, but she didn't seem to have much choice in the matter. When she stood up, she found it hard to speak. But she had to ask. What happened today, Harry? I don't know the answers to any of the important questions either. Aside from that, I'd really rather not think about it for a while. Minerva took his hand in hers again, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. It was only a short trip, since naturally the office of the deputy was close to the office of the headmaster. Minerva sat behind her desk. Harry sat in front of her desk. So, Minerva whispered, she would have given almost anything not to do this, or not to be the one who had to do it, or for it to be any time but right now. There is a matter of school discipline, from which you are not exempt. Namely, said Harry. He didn't know. He hadn't figured it out yet. She felt her throat tighten. But there was work to be done and she would not shirk it. Mr. Potter, said Professor McGonagall, I need to see your time turner, please. All the peace of the phoenix vanished from his face in an instant and Minerva felt like she had just stabbed him. No, Harry said. His voice was panicked. I need it. I won't be able to attend Hogwarts. I won't be able to sleep. You'll be able to sleep, she said. The ministry has delivered the protective shell for your time turner. I will enchant it to open only between the hours of 9 p.m. and midnight. Harry's face twisted. But I. Mr. Potter, how many times have you used the time turner since Monday? How many hours? Harry said. Hold on, let me add it up. He glanced down at his watch. Minerva felt a rush of sadness. She'd thought so. It wasn't just 2 per day, then. I suspect that if I asked your dormmates, I would find that you were struggling to stay up long enough to go to sleep at a reasonable time, and waking up earlier and earlier every morning. Correct. Harry's face said everything she needed to know. Mr. Potter, she said gently, there are students who cannot be entrusted with time turners because they become addicted to them. We give them a potion which lengthens their sleep cycle by the necessary amount, but they end up using the time turner for more than just attending their classes. And so we must take them back. Mr. Potter, you have taken to using the time turner as your solution to everything, often very foolishly so. You used it to get back a remembrall. You vanished from a closet in a fashion apparent to other students, instead of going back after you were out and getting me or someone else to come and open the door. From the look on Harry's face, he hadn't thought of that. And more importantly, she said, you should have simply sat in Professor Snape's class. And watched. And left at the end of class. As you would have done if you had not possessed a time turner. There are some students who cannot be entrusted with time turners, Mr. Potter. You are one of them. I am sorry. But I need it. Harry blurted. What if there are Slytherins threatening me and I have to escape? It keeps me safe. Every other student in this castle runs the same risk, and I assure you that they survive. No student has died in this castle for 50 years. Mr. Potter, you will hand over your time turner and do so now. Harry's face twisted in agony, but he drew out the time turner from under his robes and gave it to her. From her desk, Minerva drew out one of the protective shells that had been sent to Hogwarts. She snapped the cover into place around the time turner's turning hourglass, and then she laid her wand on the cover to complete the enchantment. This isn't fair, Harry shrieked. I saved half of Hogwarts from Professor Snape today, is it right that I be punished for it? I saw the look on your face, you hated what he was doing. Minerva didn't speak for a few moments. She was enchanting. When she finished and looked up, she knew that her face was stern. Maybe it was the wrong thing to do. And then again, maybe it was the right thing to do. There was an obstinate child in front of her, and that didn't mean the universe was broken. Fair, Mr. Potter, she snapped. I have had to file 2 reports with the Ministry on public use of a time turner in 2 successive days. Be extremely grateful you were allowed to retain the time turner even in restricted form. The headmaster made a flow call to plead with them personally, and if you were not the boy who lived, even that would not have sufficed. Harry gaped at her. She knew that he was seeing the angry face of Professor McGonagall. Harry's eyes filled up with tears. I'm sorry, he whispered, voice now choked and broken. I'm sorry to have disappointed you. I'm sorry too, Mr. Potter, she said sternly, and handed him the newly restricted time turner. You may go. Harry turned and fled from her office, sobbing. She heard his feet pattering away down the hall, and then the sound cut off as the door swung closed. I'm sorry too, Harry, she whispered to the quiet room. I'm sorry too. 15 minutes into lunch hour. No one was speaking to Harry. Some of the Ravenclaws were shooting him looks of anger, others of sympathy, a few of the youngest students even had looks of admiration, but no one was talking to him. Even Hermione hadn't tried to come over. Fred and George had gingerly stepped near. They hadn't said anything. The offer was clear, and its optionality. Harry had told them that he would come over when dessert started, no earlier. They had nodded and quickly walked away. It was probably the utterly expressionless look on Harry's face that was doing it. The others probably thought he was controlling anger, or dismay. They knew, because they'd seen Flitwick come and get him, that he'd been called to the headmaster's office. Harry was trying not to smile, because if he smiled, he would start laughing, and if he started laughing, he wouldn't stop until the nice people in white jackets came to haul him away. It was too much. It was just all too much. Harry had almost gone over to the dark side. His dark side had done things that seemed in retrospect insane. His dark side had won an impossible victory that might have been real and might have been a pure whim of a crazy headmaster. His dark side had protected his friends. He just couldn't handle it anymore. He needed Fox to sing to him again. He needed to use the time turner to go off and take a quiet hour to recover, but that wasn't an option anymore, and the loss was like a hole in his existence, but he couldn't think about that because then he might start laughing. 20 minutes. All the students who were going to eat lunch had arrived, almost none had departed. The tapping of a spoon rang through the great hall. If I may have your attention please, Dumbledore said. Harry Potter has something he would like to share with us. Harry took a deep breath and got up. He walked over to the head table, with every eye staring at him. Harry turned and looked out at the 4 tables. It was becoming harder and harder not to smile, but Harry kept his face expressionless as he spoke his brief and memorized speech. The truth is sacred, Harry said tonelessly. One of my most treasured possessions is a button which reads, "Speak the truth, even if your voice trembles." This, then, is the truth. Remember that. I am not saying it because I am being forced to say it, I am saying it because it is true. What I did in Professor Snape's class was foolish, stupid, childish, and an inexcusable violation of the rules of Hogwarts. I disrupted the classroom and deprived my fellow students of their irreplaceable learning time. All because I failed to control my temper. I hope that not a single one of you will ever follow my example. I certainly intend to try never to follow it again. Many of the students gazing at Harry now had solemn, unhappy looks upon their faces, such as one might see at a ceremony marking the loss of a fallen champion. At the younger parts of the Gryffindor table the look was almost universal. Until Harry raised his hand. He did not raise it high. That might have appeared peremptory. He certainly did not raise it toward Severus. Harry simply raised his hand to chest level, and softly snapped his fingers, a gesture that was seen more than heard. It was possible that most of the head table wouldn't see it at all. This seeming gesture of defiance won sudden smiles from the younger students and Gryffindors, and coldly superior sneers from Slytherin, and frowns and worried looks from all others. Harry kept his face expressionless. Thank you, he said. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Potter, said the headmaster. And now Professor Snape has something to share with us as well. Severus smoothly stood up from his place at the head table. It has been brought to my attention, he said, that my own actions played a part in provoking the admittedly inexcusable anger of Mr. Potter, and in the ensuing discussion I realized that I had forgotten how easily injured are the feelings of the young and immature. There was the sound of many people emitting muffled chokes at the same time. Severus continued as if he had not heard. The potions classroom is a dangerous place, and I still feel that strict discipline is necessary, but henceforth I will be more aware of the emotional fragility of students in their 4th year and younger. My deduction of points from Ravenclaw still stands, but I will revoke Mr. Potter's detention. Thank you. There was a single clap from the direction of Gryffindor, and faster than lightning Severus's wand was in his hand and quietus. Silence the offender. I will still demand discipline and respect in all my classes, Severus said coldly, and anyone who trifles with me will regret it. He sat down. Thank you too. Headmaster Dumbledore said cheerfully. Carry on. And Harry, still expressionless, began to walk back to his seat in Ravenclaw. There was an explosion of conversation. Two words were clearly identifiable in the beginning. The first was an initial, what, beginning many different sentences such as, what just happened, and, what the hell. The second was, Scourgify. As students cleaned up the dropped food and spit out drinks from themselves, the tablecloth, and each other. Some students were weeping openly. So was Professor Sprout. At the Gryffindor table, where a cake waited with 51 unlit candles, Fred whispered, I think we may be out of our league here, George. And from that day onward, no matter what Hermione tried to tell anyone, it would be an accepted legend of Hogwarts that Harry Potter could make absolutely anything happen by snapping his fingers. 19. Delayed gratification. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for J.K. Rowling. Draco had a stern expression on his face, and his green-trimmed robes somehow looked far more formal, serious, and well-turned out than the same exact robes as worn by the two boys behind him. Talk, said Draco. Yeah, talk. You heard da boss. Talk. You two, on the other hand, shut up. The last session of classes on Friday was about to start, in that vast auditorium where all four houses learned defense, battle magic. The last session of classes on Friday. Harry was hoping that this class would be non-stressful, and that the brilliant Professor Quirrell would realize this was perhaps not the best time to single out Harry for anything. Harry had recovered a little, but just in case, it was probably best to get in a bit of stress relief first. Harry leaned back in his chair and bestowed a look of great solemnity upon Draco and his minions. You ask, what is our aim? Harry declaimed. I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terrors, victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no. Talk about Snape, Draco hissed. What did you do? Harry wiped away the fake solemnity and gave Draco a more serious look. You saw it, Harry said. Everyone saw it. I snapped my fingers. Harry, stop teasing me. So he'd been promoted to Harry now. Interesting. And in fact Harry was fairly sure that he was meant to notice that, and feel bad if he didn't respond somehow. Harry tapped his ears and gave a significant glance at the minions. They won't talk, said Draco. Draco, Harry said, I'm going to be 100% honest here and say that yesterday I was not particularly impressed with Mr. Goyle's cunning. Mr. Goyle winced. Me neither, said Draco. I explained to him that I ended up owing you a favor because of it. Mr. Goyle winced again. But there is a big difference between that sort of mistake and being indiscreet. That really is something they've been trained from childhood to understand. All right then, Harry said. He lowered his voice, even though the background noises had gone to blurs in Draco's presence. I deduced one of Severus's secrets and did a bit of blackmail. Draco's expression hardened. Good, now tell me something you didn't tell in strict confidence to the idiots in Gryffindor, meaning that was the story you wanted to get all over the school. Harry grinned involuntarily and he knew that Draco had caught it. What is Severus saying? Harry said. That he hadn't realized how sensitive the feelings of young children were, Draco said. Even in Slytherin, even to me. Are you sure, Harry said, that you want to know something your head of house would rather you not know? Yes, Draco said without hesitation. Interesting. Then you really are going to send your minions away first, because I'm not sure I can believe everything you believe about them. Draco nodded. Okay. Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle looked very unhappy. Boss, said Mr. Crabbe. You've given Mr. Potter no reason to trust you, Draco said. Go. They left. In particular, Harry said, lowering his voice even further, I'm not entirely sure that they wouldn't just report what I said to Lucius. Father wouldn't do that, Draco said, looking genuinely aghast. They're mine. I'm sorry, Draco, Harry said. I'm just not sure I can believe everything you believe about your father. Imagine it was your secret and me telling you my father wouldn't do that. Draco nodded slowly. You're right. I'm sorry, Harry. It was wrong of me to ask it of you. How did I get this promoted? Shouldn't he hate me now? Harry had the feeling he was looking at something exploitable. He just wished his brain wasn't so exhausted. Ordinarily he would have loved to try his hand at some complicated plotting. Anyway, Harry said, trade. I tell you a fact that isn't on the grapevine, and does not go on the grapevine, and in particular does not go to your father, and in return you tell me what you and Slytherin think about the whole business. Deal. Now to make this as vague as possible. Something that wouldn't hurt much even if it did get out. What I said was true. I did discover one of Severus's secrets, and I did do some blackmail. But Severus wasn't the only person involved. I knew it, Draco said exultantly. Harry's stomach sank. He had apparently said something very significant and he did not know why. This was not a good sign. All right, Draco said. He was grinning widely now. So here's what the reaction was like in Slytherin. First, all the idiots were like, we hate Harry Potter. Let's go beat him up. Harry choked. What is wrong with the Sorting Hat? That's not Slytherin, it's Gryffindor. Not all children are prodigies, Draco said, though he was smiling in a sort of nasty conspiratorial way, as though to suggest that he privately agreed with Harry's opinion. And it took around 15 seconds for someone to explain to them why this might not be such a favor to Snape, so you're fine. Anyway, after that was the second wave of idiots, the ones who were saying, looks like Harry Potter was just another do-gooder after all. And then, Harry said, smiling even though he had no idea why that was stupid. And then the actual smart people started talking. It's obvious that you found a way to put a lot of pressure on Snape. And while that could be more than one thing, the obvious next thought is that it has something to do with Snape's unknown hold over Dumbledore. Am I right? No comment, Harry said. At least his brain was processing this part correctly. House Slytherin had wondered why Severus wasn't getting fired. And they'd concluded that Severus was blackmailing Dumbledore. Could that actually be true? But Dumbledore hadn't seemed to act like it. Draco went on talking. And the next thing the smart people pointed out was that if you could put enough pressure on Snape to make him leave half of Hogwarts alone, that meant you probably had enough power to get rid of him entirely, if you wanted. What you did to him was a humiliation, just the same way he tried to humiliate you, but you left us our head of house. Harry made his smile wider. And then the really smart people, Draco said, his face now serious, went off and had a little discussion by themselves, and someone pointed out that it would be a very stupid thing to leave an enemy around like that. If you could break his hold over Dumbledore, the obvious thing would be to just do it. Dumbledore would kick Snape out of Hogwarts and maybe even have him killed. He'd be very grateful to you, and you wouldn't have to worry about Snape sneaking into your dorm room at night with interesting potions. Harry's face was now neutral. He had not thought of that, and he really should have. And from this you concluded. Snape's hold was some secret of Dumbledore's, and you've got the secret. Draco was looking exultant. It can't be powerful enough to destroy Dumbledore entirely, or Snape would have used it by now. Snape refuses to use his hold for anything except staying king of Slytherin House in Hogwarts, and he doesn't always get what he wants even then, so it must have limits. But it's got to be really good. Father's been trying to get Snape to tell him for years. And, Harry said, now Lucius thinks maybe I can tell him. Did you already get an owl? I will tonight, Draco said, and laughed. It will say, his voice took on a different, more formal cadence, my beloved son, I've already told you of Harry Potter's potential importance. As you have already realized, his importance has now become greater and more urgent. If you see any possible avenue of friendship or point of pressure with him, you must pursue it, and the full resources of Malfoy are at your disposal if needed. Gosh. Well, Harry said, not commenting on whether or not your whole complicated edifice of theory is true, let me just say that we are not quite such good friends as yet. I know, Draco said. Then his face turned very serious, and his voice grew quiet even within the blur. Harry, has it occurred to you that if you know something Dumbledore doesn't want known, Dumbledore might simply have you killed? And it would turn the boy who lived from a potential competing leader into a valuable martyr, too. No comment, Harry said yet again. He hadn't thought of that last part, either. Didn't seem to be Dumbledore's style. But, Harry, Draco said, you've obviously got incredible talent, but you've got no training and no mentors, and you do stupid things sometimes, and you really need an advisor who knows how to do this or you're going to get hurt. Draco's face was fierce. Ah, Harry said, an advisor like Lucius. Like me, said Draco. I'll promise to keep your secrets from father, from everyone, I'll just help you figure out whatever you want to do. Wow. Harry saw that Zombie Quirrell was staggering in through the doors. Class is about to start, said Harry. I'll think about what you said, there's lots of times I do wish I had all your training, it's just I don't know how I can trust you so quickly. You shouldn't, Draco said, it's too soon. See, I'll give you good advice even if it hurts me. But we should maybe hurry up and become closer friends. I'm open to that, said Harry, who was already trying to figure out how to exploit it. Another bit of advice, Draco said hurriedly as Quirrell slouched toward his desk. Right now everyone in Slytherin's wondering about you, so if you're courting us, which I think you are, you should do something that signals friendship to Slytherin. Soon, like today or tomorrow. Letting Severus go on awarding extra house points to Slytherin wasn't enough. No reason Harry couldn't take credit for it. Draco's eyes flickered with realization, then he said rapidly, it's not the same, trust me, it's got to be something obvious. Push your mudblood rival Granger into a wall or something, everyone in Slytherin will know what that means. That is not how it works in Ravenclaw, Draco. If you have to push someone into a wall, it means your brain is too weak to beat them the right way, and everyone in Ravenclaw knows that. The screen on Harry's desk flickered on, provoking a sudden wash of nostalgia for television and computers. Ahem, said Professor Quirrell's voice, seeming to speak personally to Harry out of the screen. Please take your seats. And the children were all seated and staring at the repeater screens on their desks, or looking down directly at the great white marble stage where Professor Quirrell stood, leaning on his desk atop the small dais of darker marble. Today, said Professor Quirrell, I had planned to teach you your first defensive spell, a small shield that was the ancestor of today's Protega. But on second thought I have changed today's lesson plan in the light of recent events. Professor Quirrell's gaze searched the rows of seats. Harry winced from where he was sitting, in the back row. He had a feeling he knew who was about to be called on. Draco, of the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy, said Professor Quirrell. Phew. Yes, Professor, said Draco. His voice was amplified, seeming to come from the repeater screen on Harry's desk, which showed Draco's face as he spoke. Then the screen shifted back to Professor Quirrell, who said, Is it your ambition to become the next Dark Lord? That's an odd question, Professor, said Draco. I mean, who'd be dumb enough to admit it? A few students laughed, but not many. Indeed, said Professor Quirrell. So while there's no point in asking any of you, it would not surprise me in the slightest if there were a student or two in my classes who harbored ambitions of being the next Dark Lord. After all, I wanted to be the next Dark Lord when I was a young Slytherin. This time the laughter was much more widespread. Well, it is the house of the ambitious, after all, Professor Quirrell said, smiling. I didn't realize until later that what I really enjoyed was battle magic, and that my true ambition was to become a great fighting wizard and someday teach at Hogwarts. In any case, when I was 13 years old, I read through the historical sections of the Hogwarts library, scrutinizing the lives and fates of past Dark Lords, and I made a list of all the mistakes that I would never make when I was a Dark Lord. Harry giggled before he could stop himself. Yes, Mr. Potter, very amusing. So, Mr. Potter, can you guess what was the very first item on that list? Great. Never use a complicated way of dealing with an enemy when you can just abracadabra them. The term, Mr. Potter, is Avada Kedavra. Professor Quirrell's voice sounded a bit sharp for some reason, and no, that was not on the list I made at age 13. Would you care to guess again? Ah, never brag to anyone about your evil master plan. Professor Quirrell laughed. Ah, now that was number 2. My, Mr. Potter, have we been reading the same books? There was more laughter, with an undertone of nervousness. Harry clenched his jaw tightly shut and said nothing. A denial would accomplish nothing. But no, the first item was, I will not go around provoking strong, vicious enemies. The history of the world would be very different if Mornlith Falconsbane or Hitler had grasped that elementary point. Now if, Mr. Potter, just if by some chance you harbor an ambition similar to the one I held as a young Slytherin, even so, I hope it is not your ambition to become a stupid Dark Lord. Professor Quirrell, Harry said, gritting his teeth, I am a Ravenclaw and it is not my ambition to be stupid, period. I know that what I did today was dumb. But it wasn't dark. I was not the one who threw the first punch in that fight. You, Mr. Potter, are an idiot. But then so was I at your age. Thus I anticipated your answer and altered today's lesson plan accordingly. Mr. Gregory Goyle, if you would come forward, please. There was a surprised pause in the classroom. Harry hadn't been expecting that. Neither, from the looks of it, had Mr. Goyle, who looked rather uncertain and worried as he mounted the marble stage and approached the dais. Professor Quirrell straightened from where he was leaning on the desk. He looked suddenly stronger, and his hands formed fists and he drew himself up into a clearly recognizable martial arts stance. Harry's eyes widened at the sight, and he realized why Mr. Goyle had been called up. Most wizards, Professor Quirrell said, do not bother much with what a muggle would term martial arts. Is not a wand stronger than a fist? This attitude is stupid. Wands are held in fists. If you want to be a great fighting wizard, you must learn martial arts to a level which would impress even a muggle. I will now demonstrate a certain vitally important technique, which I learned in a dojo, a muggle school of martial arts, of which I shall speak more shortly. For now, Professor Quirrell took several steps forward, still in stance, advancing on where Mr. Goyle stood. Mr. Goyle, I will ask you to attack me. Professor Quirrell, said Mr. Goyle, his voice now amplified as the professor's was, can I ask what level? 6th Dan. You will not be hurt and neither will I. And if you see an opening, please take it. Mr. Goyle nodded, looking much relieved. Note, Professor Quirrell said, that Mr. Goyle was afraid to attack someone who did not know martial arts to an acceptable level, for fear that I, or he, would be hurt. Mr. Goyle's attitude is exactly correct and he has earned 3 Quirrell points for it. Now, fight. The young boy blurred forward, fists flying, and the professor blocked every blow, dancing backward. Quirrell kicked and Goyle blocked and spun and tried to trip Quirrell with a sweeping leg and Quirrell hopped over it and it was all happening too fast for Harry to make sense of what was going on and then Goyle was on his back with his legs pushing and Quirrell was actually flying through the air and then he hit the ground shoulder first and rolled. Stop! Cried Professor Quirrell from the ground, sounding a little panicked. You win. Mr. Goyle pulled up so sharply he staggered, almost tripping and falling from the aborted momentum of his headlong charge toward Professor Quirrell. His face showed utter shock. Professor Quirrell arched his back and bounced to his feet using a peculiar springing motion that made no use of his hands. There was a silence in the classroom, a silence born of total confusion. Mr. Goyle, said Professor Quirrell, what vitally important technique did I demonstrate? How to fall correctly when someone throws you, said Mr. Goyle. It's one of the very first lessons you learn. That too, said Professor Quirrell. There was a pause. The vitally important technique which I demonstrated, said Professor Quirrell, was how to lose. You may go, Mr. Goyle, thank you. Mr. Goyle walked off the platform, looking rather bewildered. Harry felt the same way. Professor Quirrell walked back to his desk and resumed leaning on it. Sometimes we forget the most basic things, since it has been too long since we learned them. I realized I had done the same with my own lesson plan. You do not teach students to throw until you have taught them to fall. And I must not teach you to fight if you do not understand how to lose. Professor Quirrell's face hardened, and Harry thought he saw a hint of pain, a touch of sorrow, in those eyes. I learned how to lose in a dojo in Asia, which, as any Muggle knows, is where all the good martial artists live. This dojo taught a style which had a reputation among fighting wizards as adapting well to magical dueling. The master of that dojo, an old man by Muggle standards, was that style's greatest living teacher. He had no idea that magic existed, of course. I applied to study there, and was one of the few students accepted that year, from among many contenders. There might have been a tiny bit of special influence involved. There was some laughter in the classroom. Harry didn't share it. That hadn't been right at all. In any case, during one of my first fights, after I had been beaten in a particularly humiliating fashion, I lost control and attacked my sparring partner. Yikes. Thankfully with my fists, rather than my magic. The master, surprisingly, did not expel me on the spot. But he told me that there was a flaw in my temperament. He explained it to me, and I knew that he was right. And then he said that I would learn how to lose. Professor Quirrell's face was expressionless. Upon his strict orders, all of the students of the dojo lined up. One by one, they approached me. I was not to defend myself. I was only to beg for mercy. One by one, they slapped me, or punched me, and pushed me to the ground. Some of them spat on me. They called me awful names in their language. And to each one, I had to say, I lose. And similar such things, such as, I beg you to stop. And, I admit you're better than me. Harry was trying to imagine this and simply failing. There was no way something like that could have happened to the dignified Professor Quirrell. I was a prodigy of battle magic even then. With wandless magic alone I could have killed everyone in that dojo. I did not do so. I learned to lose. To this day I remember it as one of the most unpleasant hours of my life. And when I left the dojo 8 months later, which was not nearly enough time, but was all I could afford to spend, the master told me that he hoped I understood why that had been necessary. And I told him that it was one of the most valuable lessons I had ever learned. Which was, and is, true. Professor Quirrell's face turned bitter. You are wondering where this marvelous dojo is, and whether you can study there. You cannot. For not long afterward, another would-be student came to that hidden place, to that remote mountain. He who must not be named. There was the sound of many breaths being drawn in simultaneously. Harry felt sick to his stomach. He knew what was coming. The Dark Lord came to that school openly, without disguise, glowing red eyes and all. The students tried to bar his way and he simply operated through. There was terror there, but discipline, and the master came forth. And the Dark Lord demanded, not asked, but demanded, to be taught. Professor Quirrell's face was very hard. Perhaps the master had read too many books telling the lie that a true martial artist could defeat even demons. For whatever reason, the master refused. The Dark Lord asked why he could not be a student. The master told him he had no patience, and that was when the Dark Lord ripped his tongue out. There was a collective gasp. You can guess what happened next. The students tried to rush the Dark Lord and fell over, stunned where they stood. And then, Professor Quirrell's voice faltered for a moment, then resumed. There is an unforgivable curse, the Cruciatus curse, which produces unbearable pain. If the Cruciatus is extended for longer than a few minutes, it produces permanent insanity. One by one, the Dark Lord crucioed the master's students into insanity, and then finished them off with the killing curse, while the master was forced to watch. When all his students had died in this way, the master followed. I learned this from the single surviving student, whom the Dark Lord had left alive to tell the tale, and who had been a friend of mine. Professor Quirrell turned away, and when he turned back a moment later, he once again seemed calm and composed. Dark wizards cannot keep their tempers, Professor Quirrell said quietly. It is a nearly universal flaw of the species, and anyone who makes a habit of fighting them soon learns to rely on it. Understand that the Dark Lord did not win that day. His goal was to learn martial arts, and yet he left without a single lesson. The Dark Lord was foolish to wish that story retold. It did not show his strength, but rather an exploitable weakness. Professor Quirrell's gaze focused on a single child in the classroom. Harry Potter, Professor Quirrell said. Yes, Harry said, his voice hoarse. What precisely did you do wrong today, Mr. Potter? Harry felt like he was going to throw up. I lost my temper. That is not precise, said Professor Quirrell. I will describe it more exactly. There are many animals which have what are called dominance contests. They rush at each other with horns, trying to knock each other down, not gore each other. They fight with their paws, with claws sheathed. But why with their claws sheathed? Surely, if they used their claws, they would stand a better chance of winning. But then their enemy might unsheathe their claws as well, and instead of resolving the dominance contest with a winner and a loser, both of them might be severely hurt. Professor Quirrell's gaze seemed to come straight out at Harry from the repeater screen. What you demonstrated today, Mr. Potter, is that, unlike those animals who keep their claws sheathed and accept the results, you do not know how to lose a dominance contest. When a Hogwarts professor challenged you, you did not back down. When it looked like you might lose, you unsheathed your claws, heedless of the danger. You escalated, and then you escalated again. It started with a slap at you from Professor Snape, who was obviously dominant over you. Instead of losing, you slapped back and lost 10 points from Ravenclaw. Soon you were talking about leaving Hogwarts. The fact that you escalated even further in some unknown direction, and somehow won at the end, does not change the fact that you are an idiot. I understand, Harry said. His throat was dry. That had been precise. Frighteningly precise. Now that Professor Quirrell had said it, Harry could see in hindsight that it was an exactly accurate description of what had happened. When someone's model of you was that good, you had to wonder whether they were right about other things too, like your intent to kill. The next time, Mr. Potter, that you choose to escalate a contest rather than lose, you may lose all the stakes you place on the table. I cannot guess what they were today. I can guess that they were far, far too high for the loss of 10 house points. Like the fate of Magical Britain. That was what he'd done. You will protest that you were trying to help all of Hogwarts, a much more important goal worthy of great risks. That is a lie. If you had been, I would have taken the slap, waited, and picked the best possible time to make my move, Harry said, his voice hoarse. But that would have meant losing. Letting him be dominant over me. It was what the Dark Lord couldn't do with the master he wanted to learn from. Professor Quirrell nodded. I see that you have understood perfectly. And so, Mr. Potter, today you are going to learn how to lose. I will not hear any objections, Mr. Potter. It is evident both that you need this and that you are strong enough to take it. I assure you that your experience will not be so harsh as what I went through, though you may well remember it as the worst 15 minutes of your young life. Harry swallowed. Professor Quirrell, he said in a small voice, can we do this some other time? No, Professor Quirrell said simply. You are 5 days into your Hogwarts education and already this has happened. Today is Friday. Our next defense class is on Wednesday. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. No, we do not have time to wait. There were a few laughs at this, but very few. Please consider it an order from your professor, Mr. Potter. What I would like to say is that otherwise I will not teach you any offensive spells because I would then hear that you had severely hurt or even killed someone. Unfortunately, I am told that your fingers are already powerful weapons. Do not snap them at any time during this lesson. More scattered laughter, sounding rather nervous. Harry felt like he might cry. Professor Quirrell, if you do anything like what you talked about, it's going to make me angry, and I really would rather not get angry again today. The point is not to avoid getting angry, Professor Quirrell said, his face looking grave. Anger is natural. You need to learn how to lose even when you are angry. Or at least pretend to lose so that you can plan your vengeance. As I did with Mr. Goyle today, unless of course any of you think he really is better. I'm not, shouted Mr. Goyle from his desk, sounding a little frantic. I know you didn't really lose. Please don't plan any vengeances. Harry felt sick to his stomach. Professor Quirrell didn't know about his mysterious dark side. Professor, we really need to talk about this after class. We will, Professor Quirrell said in the tones of a promise. After you learn how to lose. His face was serious. It should go without saying that I will exclude anything which could injure you or even cause you significant pain. The pain will come from the difficulty of losing, instead of fighting back and escalating the battle until you win. Harry's breath was coming in short, panicky pants. He was more frightened than he'd been after leaving the potions classroom. Professor Quirrell, he managed to say, I don't want you to get fired over this. I will not be, Professor Quirrell said, if you tell them afterward that it was necessary. And this I trust you to do. For a moment Professor Quirrell's voice turned very dry. Believe me, they have tolerated worse in their hallways. This case will be exceptional only in that it happens within a classroom. Professor Quirrell, Harry whispered, but he thought his voice was still being repeated everywhere. Do you really believe that if I don't do this, I might hurt someone? Yes, Professor Quirrell said simply. Then, Harry felt nauseous, I'll do it. Professor Quirrell turned to regard the Slytherins. So, with the full approval of your teacher, and in such a fashion that Snape cannot be blamed for your actions. Do any of you wish to show your dominance over the boy who lived? Shove him around, push him to the ground, hear him beg for your mercy. 5 hands went up. Everyone with your hand raised, you are an absolute idiot. What part of pretending to lose did you not understand? If Harry Potter does become the next Dark Lord, he will hunt you down and kill you after he graduates. The 5 hands dropped abruptly back to their desks. I won't, Harry said, his voice coming out rather weakly. I swear never to take vengeance upon those who help me learn to lose. Professor Quirrell, would you please stop that? Professor Quirrell sighed. I am sorry, Mr. Potter. I realize that you must find this equally annoying whether you intend to become a Dark Lord or not. But those children also had an important life lesson to learn. Would it be acceptable if I awarded you a Quirrell point in apology? Make it 2, Harry said. There was a current of surprised laughter, diffusing some of the tension. Done, Professor Quirrell said. And after I graduate, I'm going to hunt you down and tickle you. There was more laughter, although Professor Quirrell didn't smile. Harry felt like he was wrestling an anaconda, trying to force the conversation through the narrow course that would make people realize he wasn't a Dark Lord after all. Why was Professor Quirrell so suspicious of him? Professor, said Draco's unamplified voice. It is also not my own ambition to become a stupid Dark Lord. There was a shocked silence in the classroom. You don't have to do this. Harry almost blurted out loud, but checked himself in time. Draco might not wish it known that he was doing this out of friendship for Harry. Or out of the desire to appear friendly. Calling that a desire to appear friendly made Harry feel small and mean. If Draco had intended to impress him, it was working perfectly. Professor Quirrell was regarding Draco gravely. You worry that you cannot pretend to lose, Mr. Malfoy. That this flaw which describes Mr. Potter also describes you. Surely your father taught you better. When it comes to talking, maybe, said Draco, now on the repeater screen. Not when it comes to being shoved around and pushed to the ground. I want to be fully as strong as you, Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell's eyebrows went up and stayed up. I am afraid, Mr. Malfoy, he said after a time, that the arrangements I made for Mr. Potter, involving some older Slytherins who will be told afterward how stupid they were, would not carry over onto you. But it is my professional opinion that you are already very strong. Should I hear that you have failed, as Mr. Potter failed today, I will make the appropriate arrangements and apologize to you and whomever you have hurt. I do not think this will be necessary, however. I understand, Professor, said Draco. Professor Quirrell looked over the class. Does anyone else wish to become strong? Some students glanced around nervously. Some, Harry thought from his back row, looked like they were opening their mouths but not saying anything. In the end, no one spoke. Draco Malfoy will be one of the generals of your year's armies, said Professor Quirrell, should he deign to engage in that after-school activity. And now, Mr. Potter, please come forward. Yes, Professor Quirrell had said, it must be in front of everyone, in front of your friends, because that is where Snape confronted you and that is where you must learn to lose. So now the first year watched. In magically enforced silence, and with requests from both Harry and the professor not to intervene. Hermione had her face turned away, but she hadn't spoken out or even given him any sort of significant look, maybe because she'd been there in potions too. Harry stood on a soft blue mat such as might be found in a Muggle dojo, which Professor Quirrell had laid out upon the floor for when Harry was pushed down. Harry was frightened of what he might do. If Professor Quirrell was right about his intent to kill. Harry's wand lay on Professor Quirrell's desk, not because Harry knew any spells that could defend him, but because otherwise, Harry thought, he might have tried to jam it through someone's eye socket. His pouch lay there, now containing his protected but still potentially fragile time turner. Harry had pleaded with Professor Quirrell to transfigure him some boxing gloves and lock them on his hands. Professor Quirrell had given him a look of silent understanding, and refused. I will not go for their eyes, I will not go for their eyes, I will not go for their eyes, it would be the end of my life in Hogwarts, I'll be arrested, Harry chanted to himself, trying to hammer the thought into his brain, hoping it would stay there if his intent to kill took over. Professor Quirrell returned, escorting 13 older Slytherins of different years. Harry recognized one of them as the one he'd hit with a pie. 2 others from that confrontation were also present. The one who'd said to stop, that they really shouldn't do this, was missing. I repeat, Professor Quirrell said, sounding very stern, Potter is not to be really hurt. Any and all accidents will be treated as deliberate. Do you understand? The older Slytherins nodded, grinning. Then please feel free to take the boy who lived down a few pegs, Professor Quirrell said, with a twisted smile that only the first years understood. By some form of mutual consent, the pie target was at the front of the group. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, meet Mr. Peregrine Derek. He is better than you and he is about to show you that. Derek strode forward and Harry's brain screamed discordantly, he must not run away, he must not fight back. Derek stopped an arm's length away from Harry. Harry wasn't angry yet, just frightened. And that meant he beheld a teenage boy fully half a meter taller than himself, with clearly defined muscles, facial hair, and a grin of terrible anticipation. Ask him not to hurt you, Professor Quirrell said. Perhaps if he sees that you're pathetic enough, he'll decide that you're boring, and go away. There was laughter from the watching older Slytherins. Please, Harry said, his voice faltering, don't hurt me. That didn't sound very sincere, said Professor Quirrell. Derek's smile widened. The clumsy imbecile was looking very superior and... Harry's blood temperature was dropping. Please don't hurt me, Harry tried again. Professor Quirrell shook his head. How in Merlin's name did you manage to make that sound like an insult, Potter? There is only one response you can possibly expect from Mr. Derek. Derek stepped forward deliberately, and bumped into Harry. Harry staggered back a few feet and, before he could stop himself, straightened up icily. Wrong, said Professor Quirrell, wrong, wrong, wrong. You bumped into me, Potter, Derek said. Apologize. I'm sorry. You don't sound sorry, said Derek. Harry's eyes widened in indignation, he had managed to make that sound pleading. Derek pushed him, hard, and Harry fell to the mat on his hands and knees. The blue fabric seemed to waver in Harry's vision, not far away. He was beginning to doubt Professor Quirrell's real motives in teaching this so-called lesson. A foot rested on Harry's buttocks and a moment later Harry was pushed hard to the side, sending him sprawling on his back. Derek laughed. This is fun, he said. All he had to do was say it was over. And report the whole thing to the headmaster's office. That would be the end of this defense professor and his ill-fated stay at Hogwarts, and Professor McGonagall would be angry about that, but... An image of Professor McGonagall's face flashed before his eyes. She didn't look angry, just sad. Now tell him that he's better than you, Potter, said Professor Quirrell's voice. You're better than me. Harry started to raise himself and Derek put a foot on his chest and shoved him back down to the mat. The world was becoming transparent as crystal. Lines of action and their consequences stretched out before him in utter clarity. The fool wouldn't be expecting him to strike back. A quick hit in the groin would stun him long enough for... Try again, said Professor Quirrell, and with a sudden sharp motion Harry rolled and sprang to his feet and whirled on where stood his real enemy, the defense professor. Professor Quirrell said, you have no patience. Harry faltered. His mind, well honed in pessimism, drew a picture of a wizened old man with blood pouring from his mouth after Harry had ripped his tongue out. A moment later, Derek pushed Harry to the mat again and then sat down on him, sending Harry's breath whooshing out. Stop! Harry screamed. Please stop. Better, said Professor Quirrell. That even sounded sincere. It had been. That was the horrible thing, the sickening thing, it had been sincere. Harry was panting rapidly, fear and cold anger both flushing through him. Lose, said Professor Quirrell. I lose, Harry forced out. I like it, Derek said from on top of him. Lose some more. Hands shoved Harry, sending him stumbling across the circle of older Slytherins to another set of hands that shoved him again. Harry had long since passed the point of trying not to cry, and was now just trying not to fall down. What are you, Potter? Said Derek. Loser, I lose, I give up, you win, you're be better than me, please stop. Harry tripped over a foot and went crashing to the ground, hands not quite able to catch himself. He was dazed for a moment, then began struggling to his feet again. Enough, said Professor Quirrell's voice, sounding sharp enough to cut iron. Step away from Mr. Potter. Harry saw the surprised looks on their faces. The chill in his blood, which had been flowing and ebbing, smiled in cold satisfaction. Then Harry collapsed to the mat. Professor Quirrell talked. There were gasps from the older Slytherins. And I believe the Scion of Malfoy has something he wants to explain to you as well, finished Professor Quirrell. Draco's voice started talking. His voice sounded almost as sharp as Professor Quirrell's. It had acquired the same cadence Draco had used to imitate his father, and it was saying things like could have put Slytherin House in jeopardy and who knows how many allies in this school alone, and total lack of awareness, never mind cunning and dull thugs, useful for nothing but lackeys, and something in Harry's hindbrain, despite everything he knew, was designating Draco as an ally. Harry ached all over, was probably bruised, his body felt cold, his mind utterly exhausted. He tried to think of Fox's song, but without the phoenix present he couldn't remember the melody, and when he tried to imagine it he couldn't seem to think of anything except a bird chirping. Then Draco stopped talking and Professor Quirrell told the older Slytherins they were dismissed, and Harry opened his eyes and struggled to sit up. Wait, Harry said, forcing the words out, there's something I want to say to them. Wait on Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said coldly to the departing Slytherins. Harry swayed to his feet. He was careful not to look in the direction of his classmates. He didn't want to see how they were looking at him now. He didn't want to see their pity. So instead Harry looked at the older Slytherins, who still seemed to be in a state of shock. They stared back at him. Dread was on their faces. His dark side, when it was in control, had held to the imagination of this moment, and went on pretending to lose. Harry said, no one will. Stop, said Professor Quirrell. If that's what I think it is, please wait until after they're gone. They'll hear about it later. We all have our lessons to learn, Mr. Potter. All right, Harry said. You, go. The older Slytherins fled and the door closed behind them. No one's to take any revenge on them, Harry said hoarsely. That's a request to anyone who considers themselves my friend. I had my lesson to learn, they helped me learn it, they had their lesson to learn too, it's over. If you tell this story, make sure you tell that part too. Harry turned to look at Professor Quirrell. You lost, said Professor Quirrell, his voice gentle for the first time. It sounded strange coming from the professor, like his voice shouldn't even be able to do that. Harry had lost. There had been moments when the cold anger had faded entirely, replaced by fear, and during those moments he'd begged the older Slytherins and he'd meant it. And are you yet alive? Said Professor Quirrell, still with that strange gentleness. Harry managed to nod. Not all losing is like this, said Professor Quirrell. There are compromises and negotiated surrenders. There are other ways to placate bullies. There is a whole art form to manipulating others by letting them be dominant over you. But first, losing must be thinkable. Will you remember how you lost? Yes. Will you be able to lose? I think so. I think so too. Professor Quirrell bowed so low that his thin hair almost touched the floor. Congratulations, Harry Potter, you win. There was no single source, no first mover, the applause started all at once like a massive thunderclap. Harry's couldn't keep the shock from his face. He risked a glance at his classmates, and he saw their faces showing not pity but awe. The applause was coming from Ravenclaw and Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and even Slytherin, probably because Draco Malfoy was applauding too. Some students were standing up from their chairs and half of Gryffindor was standing on their desks. So Harry stood there, swaying, letting their respect wash over him, feeling stronger, and maybe even a little healed. Professor Quirrell waited for the applause to die away. It took quite a while. Surprised, Mr. Potter? Professor Quirrell said. His voice sounded amused. You have just found out that the real world does not always work like your worst nightmares. Yes, if you had been some poor anonymous boy being abused, then they would probably have respected you less afterward, pitied you even as they comforted you from their loftier perches. That is human nature, I'm afraid. But you they already know for a figure of power. And they saw you confront your fear and keep confronting it, even though you could have walked away at any time. Did you think less of me when I told you that I had deliberately endured being spat upon? Harry felt a burning sensation in his throat and frantically clamped down. He didn't trust this miraculous respect enough to start crying again in front of it. Your extraordinary achievement in my class deserves an extraordinary reward, Harry Potter. Please accept it with my compliments on behalf of my house, and remember from this day forward that not all Slytherins are alike. There are Slytherins, and then there are Slytherins. Professor Quirrell was smiling quite broadly as he said this. 51 points to Ravenclaw. There was a shocked pause and then pandemonium broke out among the Ravenclaw students, howling and whistling and cheering. And in the same moment Harry felt something wrong about that. Professor McGonagall had been right, there should have been consequences, there should have been a cost and a price to be paid, you couldn't just put everything back the way it was like that. But Harry saw the elated faces in Ravenclaw and knew he couldn't possibly say no. His brain made a suggestion. It was a good suggestion. Harry could not even believe his brain was still keeping him upright, let alone producing good suggestions. Professor Quirrell, Harry said, as clearly as he could through his burning throat. You are everything a member of your house should be, and I think you must be just what Salazar Slytherin had in mind when he helped found Hogwarts. I think you and your house, Draco was very slightly nodding and subtly turning his finger, keep going, and I think this calls for 3 cheers for Slytherin. With me, everyone. Harry paused. Huzzah! Only a few people managed to join in on the first try. Huzzah! This time most of Ravenclaw was in on it. Huzzah! That was almost all of Ravenclaw, a scattering of Hufflepuffs and around a quarter of Gryffindor. Draco's hand moved into a small, quick thumbs-up gesture. Most of the Slytherins had expressions of sheer shock. A few were staring at Professor Quirrell in wonder. Blaise Zabini was looking at Harry with a calculating, intrigued expression. Professor Quirrell bowed. Thank you, Harry Potter, he said, still with that broad smile. He turned to the class. Now, believe it or not, we still have half an hour left in this session, and that is enough to introduce the simple shield. Mr. Potter, of course, is going off and taking a well-earned rest. I can. Idiot, Professor Quirrell said fondly. The class was already laughing. Your classmates can teach you afterward, or I'll tutor you privately if that's what it takes. But right now, you're going through the third door from the left in the back of the stage, where you will find a bed, an assortment of exceptionally tasty snacks, and some extremely light reading from the Hogwarts library. You may not take anything else with you, particularly not your textbooks. Now go. Harry went. 20. Bayes' theorem. That which can be destroyed by the rolling should be. Harry stared up at the gray ceiling of the small room, from where he lay on the portable yet soft bed that had been placed there. He'd eaten quite a lot of Professor Quirrell's snacks, intricate confections of chocolate and other substances, dusted with sparkling sprinkles and jeweled with tiny sugar gems, looking highly expensive and proving, in fact, to be quite tasty. Harry hadn't felt the least bit guilty about it either, this he had earned. He hadn't tried to sleep. Harry had a feeling that he wouldn't like what happened when he closed his eyes. He hadn't tried to read. He wouldn't have been able to focus. Funny how Harry's brain just seemed to keep on running and running, never shutting down no matter how tired it got. It got stupider, but it refused to switch off. But there really and truly was a feeling of triumph. Anti-Dark Lord Harry program, plus 1 point didn't begin to cover it. Harry wondered what the Sorting Hat would say now, if he could put it on his head. No wonder Professor Quirrell had accused Harry of heading down the path of a Dark Lord. Harry had been too slow on the uptake, he should have seen the parallel right away. Understand that the Dark Lord did not win that day. His goal was to learn martial arts, and yet he left without a single lesson. Harry had entered the potions class with the intent to learn potions. He'd left without a single lesson. And Professor Quirrell had heard, and understood with frightening precision, and reached out and yanked Harry off that path, the path that led to his becoming a copy of you-know-who. There was a knock at the door. Classes are over, said Professor Quirrell's quiet voice. Harry approached the door and found himself suddenly nervous. Then the tension diminished as he heard Professor Quirrell's footsteps moving away from the door. What on earth is that about? Is it what's going to get him fired eventually? Harry opened the door, and saw that Professor Quirrell was now waiting several body lengths away. Does Professor Quirrell feel it too? They walked across the now deserted stage to Professor Quirrell's desk, which Professor Quirrell leaned on, and Harry, as before, stopped short of the dais. So, Professor Quirrell said. There was a friendly sense about him somehow, even though his face still kept its usual seriousness. What was it you wanted to talk to me about, Mr. Potter? I have a mysterious dark side. But Harry couldn't just blurt it out like that. Professor Quirrell, Harry said, am I off the path to becoming a Dark Lord, now? Professor Quirrell looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, he said solemnly, with only a slight grin, a word of advice. There is such a thing as a performance which is too perfect. Real people who have just been beaten and humiliated for 15 minutes do not stand up and graciously forgive their enemies. It is the sort of thing you do when you're trying to convince everyone you're not dark, not. I can't believe this. You can't have every possible observation confirm your theory. And that was a trifle too much indignation. What on earth do I have to do to convince you? To convince me that you harbor no ambitions of becoming a Dark Lord? Said Professor Quirrell, now looking outright amused. I suppose you could just raise your right hand. What? Harry said blankly. But I can raise my right hand whether or not Harry stopped, feeling rather stupid. Indeed, said Professor Quirrell. You can just as easily do it either way. There is nothing you can do to convince me because I would know that was exactly what you were trying to do. And if we are to be even more precise, then while I suppose it is barely possible that perfectly good people exist even though I have never met one, it is nonetheless improbable that someone would be beaten for 15 minutes and then stand up and feel a great surge of kindly forgiveness for his attackers. On the other hand, it is less improbable that a young child would imagine this is the role to play in order to convince his teacher and classmates that he is not the next Dark Lord. The import of an act lies not in what that act resembles on the surface, Mr. Potter, but in the states of mind which make that act more or less probable. Harry blinked. He'd just had the dichotomy between the representativeness heuristic and the Bayesian definition of evidence explained to him by a wizard. But then again, said Professor Quirrell, anyone can want to impress their friends. That need not be dark. So without it being any kind of admission, Mr. Potter, tell me honestly. What thought was in your mind at the moment when you forbade any vengeance? Was that thought a true impulse to forgiveness? Or was it an awareness of how your classmates would see the act? Sometimes we make our own Phoenix song. But Harry didn't say it out loud. It was clear that Professor Quirrell wouldn't believe him, and would probably respect him less for trying to utter such a transparent lie. After a few moments of silence, Professor Quirrell smiled with satisfaction. Believe it or not, Mr. Potter, said the professor, you need not fear me for having discovered your secret. I am not going to tell you to give up on becoming the next Dark Lord. If I could turn back the hands of time and somehow remove that ambition from the mind of my child self, the self of this present time would not benefit from the alteration. For as long as I thought that was my goal, it drove me to study and learn and refine myself and become stronger. We become what we are meant to be by following our desires wherever they lead. That is the insight of Salazar. Ask me to show you to the library section which holds those same books I read as a 13-year-old, and I will happily lead the way. For the love of crap, Harry said, and sat down on the hard marble floor, and then lay back in the floor, staring up at the distant arches of the ceiling. It was as close as he could come to collapsing in despair without hurting himself. Still too much indignation, observed Professor Quirrell. Harry wasn't looking, but he could hear the suppressed laughter in the voice. Then Harry realized. Actually, I think I know what's confusing you here, Harry said. That was what I wanted to talk to you about, in fact. Professor Quirrell, I think that what you're seeing is my mysterious dark side. There was a pause. Your dark side. Harry sat up. Professor Quirrell was regarding him with one of the strangest expressions Harry had seen on anyone's face, let alone anyone as dignified as Professor Quirrell. It happens when I get angry, Harry explained. My blood runs cold, everything gets cold, everything seems perfectly clear. In retrospect, it's been with me for a while. In my first year of Muggle school, someone tried to take away my ball during recess and I held it behind my back and kicked him in the solar plexus, which I'd read was a weak point, and the other kids didn't bother me after that. And I bit a math teacher when she wouldn't accept my dominance. But it's only just recently that I've been under enough stress to notice that it's an actual, mysterious dark side, and not just an anger management problem like the school psychologist said. And I don't have any super magical powers when it happens. That was one of the first things I checked. Professor Quirrell rubbed his nose. Let me think about this, he said. Harry waited in silence for a full minute. He used that time to stand up, which was more difficult than he had expected. Well, Professor Quirrell said after a while, I suppose there was something you could say that would convince me. I have already guessed that my dark side is really just another part of me and that the answer isn't to never become angry but to learn to stay in control by accepting it. I'm not dumb or anything and I've seen this story enough times to know where it's going, but it's hard and you seem like the person to help me. Well, yes. Very perspicacious of you, Mr. Potter, I must say. That side of you is, as you seem to have already surmised, your intent to kill, which as you say is a part of you. And needs to be trained, Harry said, completing the pattern. And needs to be trained, yes. That strange expression was still on Professor Quirrell's face. Mr. Potter, if you truly do not wish to be the next Dark Lord, then what was the ambition which the Sorting Hat tried to convince you to abandon, the ambition for which you were sorted into Slytherin? I was sorted into Ravenclaw. Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, now with a much more usual-looking dry smile, I know you are accustomed to everyone around you being a fool, but please do not mistake me for one of them. The likelihood that the Sorting Hat would play its first prank in 800 years while it was upon your head is so small as to not be worth considering. I suppose it is barely possible that you snapped your fingers and invented some simple and clever way to defeat the anti-tampering spells upon the hat, though I myself can think of no such method. But by far the most probable explanation is that Dumbledore decided he was not happy with the hat's choice for the boy who lived. This is evident to anyone with the tiniest smidgen of common sense, so your secret is safe at Hogwarts. Harry opened his mouth then closed it again with a feeling of complete helplessness. Professor Quirrell was wrong, but wrong in such a convincing way that Harry was starting to think that it simply was the rational judgment given the evidence available to Professor Quirrell. There were times, never predictable times but still sometimes, when you would get improbable evidence and the best knowable guess would be wrong. If you had a medical test that was only wrong one time in 1,000, sometimes it would still be wrong anyway. Can I ask you never to repeat what I'm about to say? Said Harry. Absolutely, said Professor Quirrell. Consider me asked. Harry wasn't a fool either. Can I consider you to have said yes? Very good, Mr. Potter. You may indeed so consider. Professor Quirrell. I won't repeat what you're about to say, Professor Quirrell said, smiling. They both laughed, then Harry turned serious again. The Sorting Hat did seem to think I was going to end up as a Dark Lord unless I went to Hufflepuff, Harry said. But I don't want to be one. Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, don't take this the wrong way. I promise you will not be graded on the answer. I only want to know your own, honest reply. Why not? Harry had that helpless feeling again. Thou shalt not become a Dark Lord was such an obvious theorem in his moral system that it was hard to describe the actual proof steps. People would get hurt. Surely you've wanted to hurt people, said Professor Quirrell. You wanted to hurt those bullies today. Being a Dark Lord means that people you want to hurt get hurt. Harry floundered for words and then decided to simply go with the obvious. First of all, just because I want to hurt someone doesn't mean it's right. What makes something right, if not your wanting it? Ah, Harry said, preference utilitarianism. Pardon me, said Professor Quirrell. It's the ethical theory that the good is what satisfies the preferences of the most people. No, Professor Quirrell said. His fingers rubbed the bridge of his nose. I don't think that's quite what I was trying to say. Mr. Potter, in the end people all do what they want to do. Sometimes people give names like right to things they want to do, but how could we possibly act on anything but our own desires? Well, obviously, Harry said. I couldn't act on moral considerations if they lacked the power to move me. But that doesn't mean my wanting to hurt those Slytherins has the power to move me more than moral considerations. Professor Quirrell blinked. Not to mention, Harry said, being a Dark Lord would mean that a lot of innocent bystanders got hurt too. Why does that matter to you? Professor Quirrell said. What have they done for you? Harry laughed. Oh, now that was around as subtle as Atlas shrugged. Pardon me, Professor Quirrell said again. It's a book that my parents wouldn't let me read because they thought it would corrupt me, so of course I read it anyway and I was offended they thought I would fall for any traps that obvious. Blah blah blah. Appeal to my sense of superiority. Other people are trying to keep me down. Blah blah blah. So you're saying I need to make my traps less obvious? Said Professor Quirrell. He tapped a finger on his cheek, looking thoughtful. I can work on that. They both laughed. But to stay with the current question, said Professor Quirrell, what have all these other people done for you? Other people have done huge amounts for me, Harry said. My parents took me in when my parents died because they were good people, and to become a Dark Lord is to betray that. Professor Quirrell was silent for a time. I confess, said Professor Quirrell quietly, when I was your age, that thought could not ever have come to me. I'm sorry, Harry said. Don't be, said Professor Quirrell. It was long ago, and I resolved my parental issues to my own satisfaction. So you are held back by the thought of your parents' disapproval. Does that mean that if they died in an accident, there would be nothing left to stop you from? No, Harry said. Just no. It is their impulse to kindness which sheltered me. That impulse is not only in my parents. And that impulse is what would be betrayed. In any case, Mr. Potter, you have not answered my original question, said Professor Quirrell finally. What is your ambition? Oh, said Harry. He organized his thoughts. To understand everything important there is to know about the universe, apply that knowledge to become omnipotent, and use that power to rewrite reality because I have some objections to the way it works now. There was a slight pause. Forgive me if this is a stupid question, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, but are you sure you did not just confess to wanting to be a Dark Lord? That's only if you use your power for evil, explained Harry. If you use the power for good, you're a Light Lord. I see, Professor Quirrell said. He tapped his other cheek with a finger. I suppose I can work with that. But Mr. Potter, while the scope of your ambition is worthy of Salazar himself, how exactly do you propose to go about it? Is step 1 to become a great fighting wizard, or head unspeakable, or minister of magic, or? Step 1 is to become a scientist. Professor Quirrell was looking at Harry as if he'd just turned into a cat. A scientist, Professor Quirrell said after a while. Harry nodded. A scientist, repeated Professor Quirrell. Yes, Harry said, I shall achieve my objectives through the power of science. A scientist, said Professor Quirrell. There was genuine indignation on his face, and his voice had grown stronger and sharper. You could be the best of all my students. The greatest fighting wizard to come out of Hogwarts in 5 decades. I cannot picture you wasting your days in a white lab coat doing pointless things to rats. Hey, said Harry, there's more to science than that. Not that there's anything wrong with experimenting on rats, of course. But science is how you go about understanding and controlling the universe. Fool, said Professor Quirrell, in a voice of quiet, bitter intensity. You're a fool, Harry Potter. He passed a hand over his face, and when that hand had passed, his face was calmer. Or more likely you have not yet found your true ambition. May I strongly recommend that you try to become a Dark Lord instead. I will do anything I can to help as a matter of public service. You don't like science, Harry said slowly. Why not? Those fool muggles will kill us all someday. Professor Quirrell's voice had grown louder. They will end it. End all of it. Harry was feeling a bit lost here. What are we talking about here? Nuclear weapons. Yes, nuclear weapons. Professor Quirrell was almost shouting now. Even he who must not be named never used those, perhaps because he didn't want to rule over a heap of ash. They never should have been made. And it will only get worse with time. Professor Quirrell was standing up straight instead of leaning on his desk. There are gates you do not open, there are seals you do not breach. The fools who can't resist meddling are killed by the lesser perils early on, and the survivors all know that there are secrets you do not share with anyone who lacks the intelligence and the discipline to discover them for themselves. Every powerful wizard knows that. Even the most terrible dark wizards know that. And those idiot muggles can't seem to figure it out. The eager little fools who discovered the secret of nuclear weapons didn't keep it to themselves, they told their fool politicians, and now we must live under the constant threat of annihilation. This was a rather different way of looking at things than Harry had grown up with. It had never occurred to him that nuclear physicists should have formed a conspiracy of silence to keep the secret of nuclear weapons from anyone not smart enough to be a nuclear physicist. The thought was intriguing, if nothing else. Would they have had secret passwords? Would they have had masks? Actually, for all Harry knew, there were all sorts of incredibly destructive secrets which physicists kept to themselves, and the secret of nuclear weapons was the only one that had escaped into the wild. The world would look the same to him either way. I'll have to think about that, Harry said to Professor Quirrell. It's a new idea to me. And one of the hidden secrets of science, passed down from a few rare teachers to their grad students, is how to avoid flushing new ideas down the toilet the instant you hear one you don't like. Professor Quirrell blinked again. Is there any sort of science you do approve of? Said Harry. Medicine, maybe. Space travel, said Professor Quirrell. But the muggles seem to be dragging their feet on the one project which might have let Wizardkind escape this planet before they blow it up. Harry nodded. I'm a big fan of the space program too. At least we have that much in common. Professor Quirrell looked at Harry. Something flickered in the professor's eyes. I will have your word, your promise and your oath never to speak of what follows. You have it, Harry said immediately. See to it that you keep your oath or you will not like the results, said Professor Quirrell. I will now cast a rare and powerful spell, not on you, but on the classroom around us. Stand still, so that you do not touch the boundaries of the spell once it has been cast. You must not interact with the magic which I am maintaining. Look only. Otherwise I will end the spell. Professor Quirrell paused. And try not to fall over. Harry nodded, puzzled and anticipatory. Professor Quirrell raised his wand and said something that Harry's ears and mind couldn't grasp at all, words that bypassed awareness and vanished into oblivion. The marble in a short radius around Harry's feet stayed constant. All the other marble of the floor vanished, the walls and ceilings vanished. Harry stood on a small circle of white marble in the midst of an endless field of stars, burning terribly bright and unwavering. There was no earth, no moon, no sun that Harry recognized. Professor Quirrell stood in the same place as before, floating in the midst of the starfield. The Milky Way was already visible as a great wash of light and it grew brighter as Harry's vision adjusted to the darkness. The sight wrenched at Harry's heart like nothing he had ever seen. Are we in space? No, said Professor Quirrell. His voice was sad and reverent. But it is a true image. Tears came into Harry's eyes. He wiped them away frantically, he would not miss this for some stupid water blurring his vision. The stars were no longer tiny jewels set in a giant velvet dome, as they were in the night sky of Earth. Here there was no sky above, no surrounding sphere. Only points of perfect light against perfect blackness, an infinite and empty void with countless tiny holes through which shone the brilliance from some unimaginable realm beyond. In space, the stars looked terribly, terribly, terribly far away. Harry kept on wiping his eyes, over and over. Sometimes, Professor Quirrell said in a voice so quiet it almost wasn't there, when this flawed world seems unusually hateful, I wonder whether there might be some other place, far away, where I should have been. I cannot seem to imagine what that place might be, and if I can't even imagine it then how can I believe it exists? And yet the universe is so very, very wide, and perhaps it might exist anyway. But the stars are so very, very far away. It would take a long, long time to get there, even if I knew the way. And I wonder what I would dream about, if I slept for a long, long time. Though it felt like sacrilege, Harry managed a whisper. Please let me stay here a while. Professor Quirrell nodded, where he stood unsupported against the stars. It was easy to forget the small circle of marble on which you stood, and your own body, and become a point of awareness which might have been still, or might have been moving. With all distances incalculable there was no way to tell. There was a time of no time. And then the stars vanished, and the classroom returned. I'm sorry, said Professor Quirrell, but we're about to have company. It's fine, Harry whispered. It was enough. He would never forget this day, and not because of the unimportant things that had happened earlier. He would learn how to cast that spell if it was the last thing he ever learned. Then the heavy oaken doors of the classroom blasted off their hinges and skittered across the marble floor with a high-pitched shriek. Quirrinus. How dare you? Like a vast thundercloud, an ancient and powerful wizard blew into the room, a look of such incandescent rage upon his face that the stern look he had earlier turned upon Harry seemed like nothing. There was a wrench of disorientation in Harry's mind as the part that wanted to run away screaming from the scariest thing it had ever seen ran away, rotating into place a part of him which could take the shock. None of Harry's facets were happy about having their stargazing interrupted. Headmaster Albus Percival, Harry started to say in icy tones. Wham! Professor Quirrell's hand came down hard upon his desk. Mr. Potter, barked Professor Quirrell. This is the headmaster of Hogwarts and you are a mere student. You will address him appropriately. Harry looked at Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell was giving Harry a stern glare. Neither of them smiled. Dumbledore's long strides had come to a halt before where Harry stood in front of the dais and Professor Quirrell stood by his desk. The headmaster stared in shock at both of them. I'm sorry, Harry said in meekly polite tones. Headmaster, thank you for wanting to protect me, but Professor Quirrell did the right thing. Slowly, Dumbledore's expression changed from something that would vaporize steel into something merely angry. I heard students saying that this man had you abused by older Slytherins. That he forbade you to defend yourself. Harry nodded. He knew exactly what was wrong with me and he showed me how to fix it. Harry, what are you talking about? I was teaching him how to lose, Professor Quirrell said dryly. It's an important life skill. It was apparent that Dumbledore still didn't understand, but his voice had lowered in register. Harry, he said slowly, if there's any threat the defense professor has offered you to prevent you from complaining. You lunatic, after today of all days do you really think I... Headmaster, Harry said, trying to look abashed, what's wrong with me isn't that I keep quiet about abusive professors. Professor Quirrell chuckled. Not perfect, Mr. Potter, but good enough for your first day. Headmaster, did you stay long enough to hear about the 51 points for Ravenclaw, or did you storm out as soon as you heard the first part? A brief look of disconcertment crossed Dumbledore's face, followed by surprise. 51 points for Ravenclaw. Professor Quirrell nodded. He wasn't expecting them, but it seemed appropriate. Tell Professor McGonagall that I think the story of what Mr. Potter went through to earn back the lost points will do just as well to make her point. No, Headmaster, Mr. Potter didn't tell me anything. It's easy to see which part of today's events are her work, just as I know that the final compromise was your own suggestion. Though I wonder how on earth Mr. Potter was able to gain the upper hand over both Snape and you, and then Professor McGonagall was able to gain the upper hand over him. Somehow Harry managed to control his face. Was it that obvious to a real Slytherin? Dumbledore came closer to Harry, scrutinizing. Your color looks a little off, Harry, the old wizard said. He peered closely at Harry's face. What did you have for lunch today? What? Harry said, his mind wobbling in sudden confusion. Why would Dumbledore be asking about deep-fried lamb and thin-sliced broccoli when that was just about the last probable cause of? The old wizard straightened up. Never mind, then. I think you're fine. Professor Quirrell coughed, loudly and deliberately. Harry looked at the professor, and saw that Professor Quirrell was staring sharply at Dumbledore. Ahem. Professor Quirrell said again. Dumbledore and Professor Quirrell locked eyes, and something seemed to pass between them. If you don't tell him, Professor Quirrell said, then, I will, even if you fire me for it. Dumbledore sighed and turned back to Harry. I apologize for invading your mental privacy, Mr. Potter, the headmaster said formally. I had no purpose except to determine if Professor Quirrell had done the same. What? The confusion lasted just exactly as long as it took Harry to understand what had just happened. You. Gently, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. His face was hard, however, as he stared at Dumbledore. Legilimency is sometimes mistaken for common sense, said the headmaster. But it leaves traces which another skillful legilimens can detect. That was all I looked for, Mr. Potter, and I asked you an irrelevant question to ensure you wouldn't think about anything important while I looked. You should have asked first. Professor Quirrell shook his head. No, Mr. Potter, the headmaster had some justification for his concerns, and had he asked for permission you would have thought of exactly those things you did not wish him to see. Professor Quirrell's voice grew sharper. I am rather more concerned, headmaster, that you saw no need to tell him afterward. You have now made it more difficult to confirm his mental privacy on future occasions, Dumbledore said. He favored Professor Quirrell with a cold look. Was that your intention, I wonder? Professor Quirrell's expression was implacable. There are too many legilimens in this school. I insist that Mr. Potter receive instruction in occlumency. Will you permit me to be his tutor? Absolutely not, Dumbledore said at once. I did not think so. Then since you have deprived him of my free services, you will pay for Mr. Potter's tutoring by a licensed occlumency instructor. Such services do not come cheaply, Dumbledore said, looking at Professor Quirrell in some surprise. Although I do have certain connections. Professor Quirrell shook his head firmly. No, Mr. Potter will ask his account manager at Gringotts to recommend a neutral instructor. With respect, Headmaster Dumbledore, after the events of this morning I must protest you or your friends having access to Mr. Potter's mind. I must also insist that the instructor have taken an unbreakable vow to reveal nothing, and that he agree to be obliviated of each session immediately afterward. Dumbledore was frowning. Such services are extremely expensive, as you well know, and I cannot help but wonder why you deem them necessary. If it's money that's the problem, Harry spoke up, I have some ideas for making large amounts of money quickly. Thank you, Quirinus, your wisdom is now quite evident and I am sorry for disputing it. Your concern for Harry Potter does you credit, as well. You're welcome, said Professor Quirrell. I hope you will not object if I go on making him a particular focus of my attentions. Professor Quirrell's face was now very serious, and very still. Dumbledore looked at Harry. It is my own wish also, Harry said. So that's how it is to be. The old wizard said slowly. Something strange passed across his face. Harry, you must realize that if you choose this man as your teacher and your friend, your first mentor, then one way or another you will lose him, and the manner in which you lose him may or may not allow you to ever get him back. That hadn't occurred to Harry. But there was that jinx on the defense position. One which had apparently worked with perfect regularity for decades. Probably, said Professor Quirrell quietly, but he will have the full use of me while I last. Dumbledore sighed. I suppose it is economical, at least, since as the defense professor you're already doomed in some unknown fashion. Harry had to work hard to suppress his expression as he realized what Dumbledore had actually been implying. I will inform Madame Pants that Mr. Potter is allowed to obtain books on occlumency, said Dumbledore. There is preliminary training which you must do on your own, said Professor Quirrell to Harry. And I do suggest that you hurry up on it. Harry nodded. I'll take my leave of you then, said Dumbledore. He nodded to both Harry and Professor Quirrell, and departed, walking a bit slowly. Can you cast the spell again? Harry said the moment Dumbledore was gone. Not today, said Professor Quirrell quietly, and not tomorrow either, I'm afraid. It takes a lot out of me to cast, though less to keep going, and so I usually prefer to maintain it as long as possible. This time I cast it on impulse. Had I thought, and realized we might be interrupted. Dumbledore was now Harry's least favorite person in the entire world. They both sighed. Even if I only ever see it once, Harry said, I will never stop being grateful to you. Professor Quirrell nodded. Have you heard of the Pioneer program? Harry said. They were probes that would fly by different planets and take pictures. 2 of the probes would end up on trajectories that took them out of the solar system and into interstellar space. So they put a golden plaque on the probes, with a picture of a man, and a woman, and showing where to find our sun in the galaxy. Professor Quirrell was silent for a moment, then smiled. Tell me, Mr. Potter, can you guess what thought went through my mind when I finished assembling the 37 items on the list of things I would never do as a Dark Lord? Put yourself in my shoes, imagine yourself in my place, and guess. Harry imagined himself looking over a list of 37 things not to do once he became a Dark Lord. You decided that if you had to follow the whole list all the time, there wouldn't be much point in becoming a Dark Lord in the first place, Harry said. Precisely, said Professor Quirrell. He was grinning. So I am going to violate Rule 2, which was simply, don't brag, and tell you about something I have done. I don't see how the knowledge could do any harm. And I strongly suspect you would have figured it out anyway, once we knew each other well enough. Nonetheless, I shall have your oath never to speak of what I am about to tell. You have it. Harry had a feeling this was going to be really good. I subscribe to a Muggle bulletin which keeps me informed of progress on space travel. I didn't hear about Pioneer 10 until they reported its launch. But when I discovered that Pioneer 11 would also be leaving the solar system forever, Professor Quirrell said, his grin the widest that Harry had yet seen from him, I snuck into NASA, I did, and I cast a lovely little spell on that lovely golden plaque which will make it last a lot longer than it otherwise would. Yes, Professor Quirrell said, who now seemed to be standing around 50 feet taller, I thought that was how you might react. Mr. Potter. Quote. I can't think of anything to say. You win seems appropriate, said Professor Quirrell. You win, Harry said immediately. See, said Professor Quirrell, we can only imagine what giant heap of trouble you would have gotten into if you had been unable to say that. They both laughed. A further thought occurred to Harry. You didn't add any extra information to the plaque, did you? Extra information, said Professor Quirrell, sounding as if the idea had never occurred to him before and he was quite intrigued. Which made Harry rather suspicious, considering that it had taken less than a minute for Harry to think of it. Maybe you included a holographic message like in Star Wars, said Harry. Or, a portrait seems to store a whole human brain's worth of information. You couldn't have added any extra mass to the probe, but maybe you could have turned an existing part into a portrait of yourself. Or you found a volunteer dying of a terminal illness, snuck them into NASA, and cast a spell to make sure their ghost ended up in the plaque. Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said, his voice suddenly sharp, a spell requiring a human death would certainly be classified by the Ministry as dark arts, regardless of circumstances. Students should not be heard talking about such things. And the amazing thing about the way Professor Quirrell said it was how perfectly it maintained plausible deniability. It had been said in exactly the appropriate tone for someone who wasn't willing to discuss such things and thought students should steer away from them. Harry honestly didn't know whether Professor Quirrell was just waiting to talk about it until after Harry had learned to protect his mind. Got it, Harry said. I won't talk with anyone else about that idea. Please be discreet about the whole matter, Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said. I prefer to go through my life without attracting public notice. You will find nothing in the newspapers about Quirinus Quirrell until I decided it was time for me to teach defense at Hogwarts. That seemed a little sad, but Harry understood. Then Harry realized the implications. So just how much awesome stuff have you done that no one else knows about? Oh, some, said Professor Quirrell. But I think that's quite enough for today, Mr. Potter. I confess I am feeling a bit tired. I understand. And thank you for everything. Professor Quirrell nodded, but he was leaning harder on his desk. Harry quickly took his leave. 21. Rationalization. Rowling is whoever does Rowling's job. Hermione Granger had worried she was turning bad. The difference between good and bad was usually easy to grasp, she'd never understood why other people had so much trouble. At Hogwarts, good was Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout. Bad was Professor Snape and Professor Quirrell and Draco Malfoy. Harry Potter was one of those unusual cases where you couldn't tell just by looking. She was still trying to figure out where he belonged. But when it came to herself, Hermione was having too much fun crushing Harry Potter. She'd done better than him in every single class they'd taken. Except for broomstick riding, which was like gym class, it didn't count. She'd gotten real house points almost every day of their first week, not for weird heroic things, but smart things like learning spells quickly and helping other students. She knew those kinds of house points were better, and the best part was, Harry Potter knew it too. She could see it in his eyes every time she won another real house point. If you were good, you weren't supposed to enjoy winning this much. It had started on the day of the train ride, though it had taken a while for the whirlwind to sink in. It wasn't until later that night that Hermione had begun to realize just how much she'd let that boy walk all over her. Before she'd met Harry Potter, she hadn't had anyone she'd wanted to crush. If someone wasn't doing as well as her in class, it was her job to help them, not rub it in. That was what it meant to be good. And now, now she was winning. Harry Potter was flinching every time she got another house point, and it was so much fun. Her parents had warned her against drugs, and she suspected this was more fun than that. She'd always liked the smiles that teachers gave her when she did something right. She'd always liked seeing the long row of check marks on a perfectly answered test. But now when she did well in class, she would casually glance around and catch a glimpse of Harry Potter gritting his teeth, and it made her want to burst into song like a Disney movie. That was bad, wasn't it? Hermione had worried she was turning bad. And then a thought had come to her which wiped away all her fears. She and Harry were getting into a romance. Of course. Everyone knew what it meant when a boy and a girl started fighting all the time. They were courting one another. There was nothing bad about that. It couldn't be that she just enjoyed beating the living scholastic daylights out of the most famous student in the school, someone who was in books and talked like books, the boy who had somehow vanquished the Dark Lord and even smushed Professor Snape like a sad little bug, the boy who was, as Professor Quirrell would have put it, dominant over everyone else in first-year Ravenclaw except for Hermione Granger, who was utterly squishing the boy who lived in all his classes besides broomstick riding. Because that would have been bad. No, it was romance. That was it. That was why they were fighting. Hermione was glad she had figured this out in time for today, when Harry would lose their book reading contest, which the whole school knew about, and she wanted to start dancing with the sheer overflowing joy of it. It was 2:45 p.m. on Saturday, and Harry Potter had half of Bathilda Bagshot's A History of Magic left to read, and she was staring at her pocket watch as it ticked with dreadful slowness toward 2:47 p.m. And the entire Ravenclaw common room was watching. It wasn't just the first years, news had spread like spilled milk, and fully half of Ravenclaw was crowded into the room, squeezed into sofas and leaning on bookcases and sitting on the arms of chairs. All 6 prefects were there, including the head girl of Hogwarts. Someone had needed to cast an air-freshening charm just so that there would be enough oxygen. And the din of conversation had died into whispers which had now faded into utter silence. 2:46 p.m. The tension was unbearable. If it had been anyone else, his defeat would have been a foregone conclusion. But this was Harry Potter, and you couldn't rule out the possibility that he would, sometime in the next few seconds, raise a hand and snap his fingers. With sudden terror, she realized how Harry Potter might be able to do exactly that. It would be just like him to have already finished reading the second half of the book earlier. Hermione's vision began to swim. She tried to make herself breathe, and found that she simply couldn't. 10 seconds left, and he still hadn't raised his hand. 5 seconds left. 2:47 p.m. Harry Potter carefully placed a bookmark into his book, closed it, and laid it aside. I would like to note for the benefit of posterity, said the boy who lived in a clear voice, that I had only half a book left, and that I ran into a number of unexpected delays. You lost, shrieked Hermione. You did. You lost our contest. There was a collective exhalation as everyone started breathing again. Harry Potter shot her a look of flaming fire, but she was floating in a halo of pure white happiness and nothing could touch her. Do you realize what kind of week I've had? Said Harry Potter. Any lesser being would have been hard-pressed to read 8 Dr. Seuss books. You set the time limit. Harry's look of flaming fire grew even hotter. I did not have any logical way of knowing I'd have to save the entire school from Professor Snape, or get beaten up in defense class, and if I told you how I lost all the time between 5 p.m. and dinner on Thursday, you would think I was insane. It sounds like someone fell prey to the planning fallacy. Raw shock showed on Harry Potter's face. Oh, that reminds me, I finished reading the first batch of books you lent me, Hermione said with her best innocent look. A couple of them had been hard books, too. She wondered how long it had taken him to finish reading them. Someday, said the boy who lived, when the distant descendants of Homo sapiens are looking back over the history of the galaxy and wondering how it all went so wrong, they will conclude that the original mistake was when someone taught Hermione Granger how to read. But you still lose, said Hermione. She held a hand to her chin and looked contemplative. Now what exactly should you lose, I wonder? What? You lost the bet, Hermione explained, so you have to pay a forfeit. I don't remember agreeing to this. Really? Said Hermione Granger. She put a thoughtful look on her face. Then, as if the idea had only just then occurred to her, we'll take a vote then. Everyone in Ravenclaw who thinks Harry Potter has to pay up, raise your hand. What? Shrieked Harry Potter again. He spun around and saw that he was surrounded by a sea of raised hands. And if Harry Potter had looked more carefully, he would have noticed that an awful lot of the onlookers seemed to be girls and that practically every female in the room had their hand raised. Stop, wailed Harry Potter. You don't know what she's going to ask. Don't you realize what she's doing? She's getting you to make an advance commitment now, and then the pressure of consistency will make you agree with whatever she says afterward. Don't worry, said the prefect Penelope Clearwater. If she asks for something unreasonable, we can just change our minds. Right, everyone. And there were eager nods from all the girls whom Penelope Clearwater had told about Hermione's plan. A silent figure quietly slipped through the chilled halls of the Hogwarts dungeons. He was to be present in a certain room at 6:00 p.m. to meet a certain someone, and if at all possible it was best to be early, to show respect. But when his hand turned the doorknob and opened the door into that dark, silent, unused classroom, there was a silhouette already standing there amid the rows of dusty old desks. A silhouette which held a small green glowing rod, casting a pale light which hardly illuminated even he who held it, let alone the surrounding room. The light of the hallway died as the door closed and shut behind him, and Draco's eyes began the process of adjusting to the dim glow. The silhouette slowly turned to behold him, revealing a shadowed face only partially lit by the eerie green light. Draco liked this meeting already. Keep the chill green light, make them both taller, give them hoods and masks, move them from a classroom to a graveyard, and it would be just like the start of half the stories his father's friends told about the Death Eaters. I want you to know, Draco Malfoy, said the silhouette in tones of deadly calm, that I do not blame you for my recent defeat. Draco opened his mouth in unthinking protest. There was no possible reason why he should be blamed. It was due, more than anything else, to my own stupidity, continued that shadowy figure. There were many other things I could have done, at any step along the way. You did not ask me to do exactly what I did. You only asked for help. I was the one who unwisely chose that particular method. But the fact remains that I lost the contest by half a book. The actions of your pet idiot, and the favor you asked for, and, yes, my own foolishness in going about it, caused me to lose time. More time than you know. Time which, in the end, proved critical. The fact remains, Draco Malfoy, that if you had not asked that favor, I would have won. And not, instead, lost. Draco had already heard about Harry's loss, and the forfeit Granger had claimed from him. The news had spread faster than owls could have carried it. I understand, Draco said. I'm sorry. There was nothing else he could say if he wanted Harry Potter to be friends with him. I am not asking for understanding or sorrow, said the dark silhouette, still with that deadly calm. But I have just spent 2 full hours in the presence of Hermione Granger, dressed in such clothing as was provided me, visiting such fascinating places in Hogwarts as a tiny burbling waterfall of what looked to me like snot, accompanied by a number of other girls who insisted on such helpful activities as strewing our path with transfigured rose petals. I have been on a date, Scion of Malfoy. My first date. And when I call that favor due, you will pay it. Draco nodded solemnly. Before arriving he had taken the wise precaution of learning every available detail of Harry's date, so that he could get all of his hysterical laughing done before their appointed meeting time, and would not commit a faux pas by giggling continuously until he lost consciousness. Do you think, Draco said, that something sad ought to happen to the Granger girl? Spread the word in Slytherin that the Granger girl is mine, and anyone who meddles in my affairs will have their remains scattered over an area wide enough to include 12 different spoken languages. And since I am not in Gryffindor and I use cunning rather than immediate frontal attacks, they should not panic if I am seen smiling at her. Or if you're seen on a second date. Draco said, allowing just a tiny note of skepticism into his voice. There will be no second date, said the green-lit silhouette in a voice so fearsome that it sounded, not only like a Death Eater, but like Amicus Carrow that one time just before Father told him to stop it. He wasn't the Dark Lord. Of course it was still a young boy's high unbroken voice, and when you combined that with the actual words, well, it just didn't work. If Harry Potter did become the next Dark Lord someday, Draco would use a pensieve to store a copy of this memory somewhere safe, and Harry Potter would never dare betray him. But let us talk of happier matters, said the green-shadowed figure. Let us talk of knowledge and of power. Draco Malfoy, let us talk of science. Yes, said Draco. Let us speak. Draco wondered how much of his own face could be seen, and how much was in shadow, in that eerie green light. And though Draco kept his face serious, there was a smile in his heart. He was finally having a real grown-up conversation. I offer you power, said the shadowy figure, and I will tell you of that power and its price. The power comes from knowing the shape of reality and so gaining control over it. What you understand, you can command, and that is power enough to walk upon the moon. The price of that power is that you must learn to ask questions of nature, and far more difficult, accept nature's answers. You will do experiments, perform tests and see what happens. And you must accept the meaning of those results when they tell you that you are mistaken. You will have to learn how to lose, not to me, but to nature. When you find yourself arguing with reality, you will have to let reality win. You will find this painful, Draco Malfoy, and I do not know if you are strong in that way. Knowing the price, is it still your wish to learn the human power? Draco took a deep breath. He'd thought about this, and it was hard to see how he could answer any other way. He'd been instructed to take every avenue of friendship with Harry Potter. It was just learning, he wasn't promising to do anything. He could always stop the lessons at any time. There were certainly any number of things about the situation which made it look like a trap, but in all honesty, Draco didn't see how this could go wrong. Plus, Draco did kind of want to rule the world. Yes, said Draco. Excellent, said the shadowy figure. I have had something of a crowded week, and it will take time to plan your curriculum. I've got a lot of things I need to do myself to consolidate my power in Slytherin, said Draco, not to mention homework. Maybe we should just start in October. Sounds sensible, said the shadowy figure, but what I meant to say is that to plan your curriculum, I need to know what I will be teaching you. 3 thoughts come to me. The first is that I teach you of the human mind and brain. The second option is that I teach you of the physical universe, those arts which lie on the pathway to visiting the moon. This involves a great deal of numbers, but to a certain kind of mind those numbers are more beautiful than anything else science has to teach. Do you like numbers, Draco? Draco shook his head. Then so much for that. You will learn your mathematics eventually, but not right away, I think. The third option is that I teach you of genetics and evolution and inheritance, what you would call blood. That one, said Draco. The figure nodded. I thought you might say as much. But I think it will be the most painful path for you, Draco. What if your family and friends, the blood purists, say one thing, and you find that the experimental test says another? Then I'll figure out how to make the experimental test say the right answer. There was a pause, as the shadowy figure stood there with its mouth open for a short while. Said the shadowy figure. It doesn't really work like that. That's what I was trying to warn you about here, Draco. You can't make the answer come out to be anything you like. You can always make the answer come out your way, said Draco. That had been practically the first thing his tutors had taught him. It's just a matter of finding the right arguments. No, said the shadowy figure, voice rising in frustration, no, no, no. Then you get the wrong answer and you can't go to the moon that way. Nature isn't a person, you can't trick them into believing something else. If you try to tell the moon it's made of cheese, you can argue for days and it won't change the moon. What you're talking about is rationalization, like starting with a sheet of paper, moving straight down to the bottom line, using ink to write, and therefore, the moon is made of cheese, and then moving back up to write all sorts of clever arguments above. But either the moon is made of cheese or it isn't. The moment you wrote the bottom line, it was already true or already false. Whether or not the whole sheet of paper ends up with the right conclusion or the wrong conclusion is fixed the instant you write down the bottom line. If you're trying to pick between 2 expensive trunks, and you like the shiny one, it doesn't matter what clever arguments you come up with for buying it. The real rule you used to choose which trunk to argue for was pick the shiny one, and however effective that rule is at picking good trunks, that's the kind of trunk you'll get. Rationality can't be used to argue for a fixed side, its only possible use is deciding which side to argue. Science isn't for convincing anyone that the blood purists are right. That's politics. The power of science comes from finding out the way nature really is. That can't be changed by arguing. What science can do is tell us how blood really works, how wizards really inherit their powers from their parents, and whether muggleborns are really weaker or stronger. Stronger, said Draco. He had been trying to follow this, a puzzled frown on his face. He could see how it sort of made sense, but it certainly wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. And then Harry Potter had said something Draco couldn't possibly let pass. You think mudbloods are stronger? I think nothing, said the shadowy figure. I know nothing. I believe nothing. My bottom line is not yet written. I will figure out how to test the magical strength of muggleborns, and the magical strength of purebloods. If my tests tell me that muggleborns are weaker, I will believe they are weaker. If my tests tell me that muggleborns are stronger, I will believe they are stronger. Knowing this and other truths, I will gain some measure of power. And you expect me to believe whatever you say? Draco demanded hotly. I expect you to perform the tests personally, said the shadowy figure quietly. Are you afraid of what you will find? Draco stared at the shadowy figure for a while, his eyes narrowed. Nice trap, Harry, he said. I'll have to remember that one, it's new. The shadowy figure shook his head. It's not a trap, Draco. Remember, I don't know what we'll find. But you do not understand the universe by arguing with it or telling it to come back with a different answer next time. When you put on the robes of a scientist, you must forget all your politics and arguments and factions and sides, silence the desperate clingings of your mind, and wish only to hear the answer of nature. The shadowy figure paused. Most people can't do it. That's why this is difficult. Are you sure you wouldn't rather just learn about the brain? And if I tell you I'd rather learn about the brain, Draco said, his voice now hard, you'll go around telling people that I was afraid of what I'd find. No, said the shadowy figure. I will do no such thing. But you might do the same sort of tests yourself, and if you got the wrong answer, I wouldn't be there to say anything before you showed it to someone else. Draco's voice was still hard. I would still ask you first, Draco, the shadowy figure said quietly. Draco paused. He hadn't been expecting that, he thought he saw the trap, but. You would. Of course. How would I know who to blackmail or what we could ask from them? Draco, I say again that this is not a trap I set for you. At least not for you personally. If your politics were different, I would be saying, what if the test shows that purebloods are stronger? Really? Yes. That's the price anyone has to pay to become a scientist. Draco held up a hand. He had to think. The shadowy, green-lit figure waited. It didn't take long to think about though. If you discarded all the confusing parts. Then Harry Potter was planning to mess around with something that could cause a gigantic political explosion, and it would be insane to just walk away and let him do it on his own. We'll study blood, said Draco. Excellent, said the figure, and smiled. Congratulations on being willing to ask the question. Thanks, Draco said, not quite managing to keep the irony out of his voice. Hey, did you think going to the moon was easy? Be glad this just involves changing your mind sometimes, and not a human sacrifice. Human sacrifice would be way easier. There was a slight pause, and then the figure nodded. Fair point. Look, Harry, said Draco without much hope, I thought the idea was to take all the things that muggles know, combine them with things that wizards know, and become masters of both worlds. Wouldn't it be a lot easier to just study all the things that muggles already found out, like the moon stuff, and use that power? No, said the figure with a sharp shake of his head, sending green shadows moving around his nose and eyes. His voice had turned very grim. If you cannot learn the scientist's art of accepting reality, then I must not tell you what that acceptance has discovered. It would be like a powerful wizard telling you of those gates which must not be opened, and those seals which must not be broken, before you had proven your intelligence and discipline by surviving the lesser perils. A chill went down Draco's spine and he shuddered involuntarily. He knew it had been visible even in the dim light. All right, said Draco. I understand. Father had told him that many times. When a more powerful wizard told you that you weren't ready to know, you didn't pry any further if you wanted to live. The figure inclined his head. Indeed. But there is something else you should understand. The first scientists, being muggles, lacked your traditions. In the beginning they simply did not comprehend the notion of dangerous knowledge, and thought that all things known should be spoken freely. When their searches turned dangerous, they told their politicians of things that should have stayed secret. Don't look like that, Draco, it wasn't simple stupidity. They did have to be smart enough to uncover the secret in the first place. But they were muggles, it was the first time they'd found anything really dangerous, and they didn't start out with a tradition of secrecy. There was a war going on, and the scientists on one side worried that if they didn't talk, the scientists of the enemy country would tell their politicians first. The voice trailed off significantly. They didn't destroy the world. But it was close. And we are not going to repeat that mistake. Right, Draco said, his voice now very firm. We won't. We're wizards, and studying science doesn't make us muggles. As you say, said the green-lit silhouette. We will establish our own science, a magical science, and that science will have smarter traditions from the very start. The voice grew hard. The knowledge I share with you will be taught alongside the disciplines of accepting truth. The level of this knowledge will be keyed to your progress in those disciplines, and you will share that knowledge with no one else who has not learned those disciplines. Do you accept this? Yes, said Draco. What was he supposed to do? Say no. Good. And what you discover for yourself, you will keep to yourself unless you think that other scientists are ready to know it. What we do share among ourselves, we will not tell the world unless we agree it is safe for the world to know. And whatever our own politics and allegiances, we will all punish any of our number who reveal dangerous magics or give away dangerous weapons, no matter what sort of war is going on. From this day onward, that will be the tradition and the law of science among wizards. Are we agreed on that? Yes, said Draco. Actually, this was starting to sound pretty attractive. The Death Eaters had tried to take power by being scarier than everyone else, and they hadn't actually won yet. Maybe it was time to try ruling using secrets instead. And our group stays hidden for as long as possible, and everyone in it has to agree to our rules. Of course. Definitely. There was a very short pause. We're going to need better robes, said the shadowy figure, with hoods and so on. I was just thinking that, said Draco. We don't need whole new robes, though, just cowled cloaks to put on. I have a friend in Slytherin, she'll take your measurements. Don't tell her what it's for, though. I'm not stupid. And no masks for now, not when it's just you and me, said the shadowy figure. Right. But later on we should have some sort of special mark that all our servants have, the mark of science, like a snake eating the moon on their right arms. It's called a PhD, and wouldn't that make it too easy to identify our people? Huh. I mean, what if someone is like, okay, now everyone pull up their robes over their right arms and our guy is like, whoops, sorry, looks like I'm a spy. Forget I said anything, said Draco, sweat suddenly springing out all over his body. He needed a distraction, fast, and what do we call ourselves? The Science Eaters. No, said the shadowy figure slowly. That doesn't sound right. Draco wiped his robed arm across his forehead, wiping away beads of moisture. What had the Dark Lord been thinking? Father had said the Dark Lord was smart. I've got it, said the shadowy figure suddenly. You won't understand yet, but trust me, it fits. Right now Draco would have accepted Malfoy Munchers, as long as it changed the subject. What is it? And standing amid the dusty desks in an unused classroom in the dungeons of Hogwarts, the green-lit silhouette of Harry Potter spread his arms dramatically and said, "This day shall mark the dawn of the Bayesian conspiracy." A silent figure trudged wearily through the halls of Hogwarts in the direction of Ravenclaw. Harry had gone straight from the meeting with Draco to dinner, and stayed at dinner barely long enough to choke down a few fast gulps of food before going off to bed. It wasn't even 7 p.m. yet, but it was well past bedtime for Harry. He'd realized last night that he wouldn't be able to use the time turner on Saturday until after the book reading contest was already over. But he could still use the time turner on Friday night, and gain time that way. So Harry had pushed himself to stay awake until 9 p.m. on Friday, when the protective shell opened, and then used the 4 hours remaining on the time turner to spin back to 5 p.m. and collapse into sleep. He'd woken up around 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, just as planned, and read for the next 12 hours straight. And it still hadn't been enough. And now Harry would be going to sleep rather early for the next few days, until his sleep cycle caught up again. The portrait on the door asked Harry some dumb riddle meant for 11-year-olds that he answered without the words even passing through his conscious mind, and then Harry staggered up the stairs to his dorm room, changed into his pajamas and collapsed into bed. And found that his pillow seemed rather lumpy. Harry groaned. He sat up reluctantly, twisted in bed, and lifted up his pillow. This revealed a note, 2 golden galleons, and a book titled Occlumency, the Hidden Arte. Harry picked up the note and read. My, you do get yourself into trouble and quickly. Your father was no match for you. You have made a powerful enemy. Snape commands the loyalty, admiration, and fear of all House Slytherin. You cannot trust any of that house now, whether they come to you in friendly guise or fearsome. From now on you must not meet Snape's eyes. He is a Legilimens and can read your mind if you do. I have enclosed a book which may help you learn to protect yourself, though there is only so far you can get without a tutor. Still you may hope to at least detect intrusion. So that you may find some extra time in which to study Occlumency, I have enclosed 2 galleons, which is the price of answer sheets and homework for the first-year History of Magic class, Professor Binns having given the same tests and same assignments every year since he died. Your newfound friends the Weasley twins should be able to sell you a copy. It goes without saying that you must not get caught with it in your possession. Of Professor Quirrell I know little. He is a Slytherin and a defense professor, and that is 2 marks against him. Consider carefully any advice he gives you, and tell him nothing you do not wish known. Dumbledore only pretends to be insane. He is extremely intelligent, and if you continue to step into closets and vanish, he will certainly deduce your possession of an invisibility cloak if he has not done so already. Avoid him whenever possible, hide the cloak of invisibility somewhere safe, not your pouch, anytime you cannot avoid him, and step with great care in his presence. Please be more careful in the future, Harry Potter. Santa Claus. Harry stared at the note. It did seem to be pretty good advice. Of course Harry wasn't going to cheat in history class even if they gave him a dead monkey for a professor. But Severus's Legilimency, whoever'd sent this note knew a lot of important, secret things and was willing to tell Harry about them. The note was still warning him against Dumbledore stealing the cloak, but at this point Harry honestly had no clue if that was a bad sign, it could just be an understandable mistake. There seemed to be some sort of intrigue going on inside Hogwarts. Maybe if Harry compared stories between Dumbledore and the note sender, he could work out a combined picture that would be accurate. Like if they both agreed on something, then. Whatever. Harry stuffed everything into his pouch and turned up the quieter and pulled the cover over his head and died. It was Sunday morning and Harry was eating pancakes in the Great Hall, sharp quick bites, glancing nervously at his watch every few seconds. It was 8:02 a.m., and in precisely 2 hours and 1 minute, it would be exactly 1 week since he'd seen the Weasleys and crossed over onto platform 9 3/4. And the thought had occurred to him. Harry didn't know if this was a valid way to think about the universe, he didn't know anything anymore, but it seemed possible. That. Not enough interesting things had happened to him over the last week. When he was done eating breakfast, Harry planned to go straight up to his room and hide in the bottom level of his trunk and not talk to anyone until 10:03 a.m. And that was when Harry saw the Weasley twins walking toward him. One of them was carrying something concealed behind his back. He should scream and run away. He should scream and run away. Whatever this was, it could very well be the grand finale. He really should just scream and run away. With a resigned feeling that the universe would come and get him anyway, Harry continued slicing at the pancake with his fork and knife. He couldn't muster the energy. That was the sad truth. Harry knew now how people felt when they were tired of running, tired of trying to escape fate, and they just fell to the ground and let the horrifically befanged and tentacled demons of the darkest abyss drag them off to their unspeakable destiny. The Weasley twins drew closer. And yet closer. Harry ate another bite of pancake. The Weasley twins arrived, grinning brightly. "Hello, Fred," Harry said dully. One of the twins nodded. "Hello, George." The other twin nodded. "You sound tired," said George. "You should cheer up," said Fred. "Look what we got you." And George took, from behind Fred's back, a cake with 12 flaming candles. There was a pause, as the Ravenclaw table stared at them. "That's not right," said someone. "Harry Potter was born on the 31st of June." "He is coming," said a huge hollow voice that cut through all conversation like a sword of ice. "The one WHO will tear apart the berry." Dumbledore had leapt out of his throne and run straight over the head table and seized hold of the woman speaking those awful words. Fawkes had appeared in a flash, and all three of them vanished in a crack of fire. There was a shocked pause, followed by heads turning in the direction of Harry Potter. "I didn't do it," Harry said in a tired voice. "That was a prophecy," someone at the table hissed. "And I bet it's about you." Harry sighed. He stood up from his seat, raised his voice, and said very loudly over the conversations that were starting up, "It's not about me. Obviously. I'm not coming here, I'm already here." Harry sat back down again. The people who had been looking at him turned away again. Someone else at the table said, "Then who is it about?" And with a dull, leaden sensation, Harry realized who wasn't already at Hogwarts. Call it a wild guess, but Harry had a feeling the undead Dark Lord would be showing up one of these days. The conversation continued on around him. "Not to mention, tear apart the berry what? I thought I heard Trelawney start to say something with an S just before the headmaster grabbed her. Like, soul, sun. If someone's going to tear apart the sun, we're really in trouble." That seemed rather unlikely to Harry, unless the world contained scary things which had heard of David Criswell's ideas about star lifting. "So," Harry said in tired tones, "this happens every Sunday breakfast, does it?" "No," said a student who might have been in his 7th year, frowning grimly. "It doesn't." Harry shrugged. "Whatever. Anyone want some birthday cake?" "But it's not your birthday," said the same student who'd objected last time. That was the cue for Fred and George to start laughing, of course. Even Harry managed a weary smile. As the first slice was served to him, Harry said, "I've had a really long week." And Harry was sitting in the cavern level of his trunk, slid shut and locked so no one could get in, a blanket pulled over his head, waiting for the week to be over. 10:01. 10:02. 10:03, but just to be sure. 10:04, and the first week was done. Harry breathed a sigh of relief, and gingerly pulled the blanket off of his head. A few moments later, he had emerged into the bright sunlit air of his dorm. Shortly after, and he was in the Ravenclaw common room. A few people looked at him, but no one said anything or tried to talk to him. Harry found a nice wide writing desk, pulled back a comfortable chair, and sat down. From his pouch he drew a sheet of paper and a pencil. Mum and Dad had told Harry in no uncertain terms that while they understood his enthusiasm for leaving home and getting away from his parents, he was to write them every week without fail, just so that they knew he was alive, unharmed, and not in prison. Harry stared down at the blank sheet of paper. Let's see. After leaving his parents at the train station, he'd gotten acquainted with a boy raised by Darth Vader, become friends with the 3 most infamous pranksters in Hogwarts, met Hermione, then there'd been the incident with the Sorting Hat. Monday he'd been given a time machine to treat his sleep disorder, gotten a legendary invisibility cloak from an unknown benefactor, rescued 7 Hufflepuffs by staring down 5 scary older boys, one of whom had threatened to break his finger, realized that he possessed a mysterious dark side, learned to cast Frigidaire in Charms class, and gotten started on his rivalry with Hermione. Tuesday had introduced astronomy taught by Professor Aurora Sinistra, who was nice, and history of magic taught by a ghost who ought to be exorcised and replaced with a tape recorder. Wednesday, he'd been pronounced the most dangerous student in the classroom. Thursday, let's not even think about Thursday. Friday, the incident in potions class, followed by his blackmailing the headmaster, followed by the defense professor having him beaten up in class, followed by the defense professor turning out to be the most awesome human being who still walked the face of the earth. Saturday he'd lost a bet and gone on his first date and started redeeming Draco. And then this morning Professor Trelawney's unheard prophecy might or might not indicate that an immortal Dark Lord was about to attack Hogwarts. Harry mentally organized his material, and started writing. Dear Mum and Dad. Hogwarts is lots of fun. I learned how to violate the second law of thermodynamics in charms class, and I met a girl named Hermione Granger who reads faster than I do. I'd better leave it at that. Your loving son, Harry James Potter Evans Veras. 22. The scientific method. Something, somewhere, somewhen, must have happened differently. Petunia Evans married Michael Veras, a professor of biochemistry at Oxford. Harry James Potter Evans VERRES grew up in a house filled to the brim with books. He once bit a math teacher who didn't know what a logarithm was. He's read Gödel, Escher, Bach and Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases in Volume 1 of the Feynman Lectures on Physics. And despite what everyone who's met him seems to fear, he doesn't want to become the next Dark Lord. He was raised better than that. He wants to discover the laws of magic and become a god. Hermione Granger is doing better than him in every class except broomstick riding. Draco Malfoy is exactly what you would expect an 11-year-old boy to be like if Darth Vader were his doting father. Professor Quirrell is living his lifelong dream of teaching defense against the dark arts, or as he prefers to call his class, battle magic. His students are all wondering what's going to go wrong with the defense professor this time. Dumbledore is either insane, or playing some vastly deeper game which involved setting fire to a chicken. Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall needs to go off somewhere private and scream for a while. Presenting Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. You ain't guessin' where this one's going. Some notes. The opinions of characters in this story are not necessarily those of the author. What warm Harry thinks is often meant is a good pattern to follow, especially if Harry thinks about how he can cite scientific studies to back up a particular principle. But not everything Harry does or thinks is a good idea. That wouldn't work as a story. And the less warm characters may sometimes have valuable lessons to offer, but those lessons may also be dangerously double-edged. If you haven't visited hpmor.com, don't forget to do that at some point, otherwise you'll miss out on the fan art, how to learn everything Harry knows, and more. If you haven't just enjoyed this fic but learned something from it, then please consider blogging it or tweeting it. A work like this only does as much good as there are people who read it. And now, back to your regularly scheduled fic. The key to strategy is not to choose a path to J.K. Rowling, but to choose so that all paths lead to a J.K. Rowling. A small study room, near but not in the Ravenclaw dorm, one of the many unused rooms of Hogwarts. Gray stone the floors, red brick the walls, dark stained wood the ceiling, 4 glowing glass globes set into the 4 walls of the room. A circular table that looked like a wide slab of black marble set on thick black marble legs for columns, but which had proved to be very light, weight and mass both, and wasn't difficult to pick up and move around if necessary. 2 comfortably cushioned chairs which had seemed at first to be locked to the floor in inconvenient places, but which would, the 2 of them had finally discovered, scoot around to where you stood as soon as you leaned over in a posture that looked like you were about to sit down. There also seemed to be a number of bats flying around the room. That was where, future historians would one day record, if the whole project ever actually amounted to anything, the scientific study of magic had begun, with 2 young first-year Hogwarts students. Harry James Potter Evans Veras, theorist. And Hermione Jean Granger, experimenter and test subject. Harry was doing better in classes now, at least the classes he considered interesting. He'd read more books, and not books for 11-year-olds either. He'd practice Transfiguration over and over during one of his extra hours every day, taking the other hour for beginning occlumency. He was taking the worthwhile classes seriously, not just turning in his homework every day, but using his free time to learn more than was required, to read other books beyond the given textbooks, looking to master the subject and not just memorize a few test answers, to excel. You didn't see that much outside Ravenclaw. And now even within Ravenclaw, his only remaining competitors were Padma Patil, whose parents came from a non-English speaking culture and thus had raised her with an actual work ethic, Anthony Goldstein, out of a certain tiny ethnic group that won 25% of the Nobel Prizes, and of course, striding far above everyone like a titan strolling through a pack of puppies, Hermione Granger. To run this particular experiment you needed the test subject to learn 16 new spells, on their own, without help or correction. That meant the test subject was Hermione. Period. It should be mentioned at this point that the bats flying around the room were not glowing. Harry was having trouble accepting the implications of this. Oogly boogly, Hermione said again. Again, at the tip of Hermione's wand, there was the abrupt, transitionless appearance of a bat. One moment, empty air. The next moment, bat. Its wings seemed to be already moving in the instant when it appeared. And it still wasn't glowing. Can I stop now? Said Hermione. Are you sure? Harry said through what seemed to be a block in his throat that maybe with a bit more practice you couldn't get it to glow. He was violating the experimental procedure he'd written down beforehand, which was a sin, and he was violating it because he didn't like the results he was getting, which was a mortal sin. You could go to science hell for that, but it didn't seem to be mattering anyway. What did you change this time? Hermione said, sounding a little weary. The durations of the U, A, and E sounds. It's supposed to be 3 to 2 to 2, not 3 to 1 to 1. Oogly boogly, said Hermione. The bat materialized with only one wing and spun pathetically to the floor, flopping around in a circle on the gray stone. Now what is it really? Said Hermione. 3 to 2 to 1. Oogly boogly. This time the bat didn't have any wings at all and fell with a plop like a dead mouse. 3 to 1 to 2. And lo, the bat did materialize and it did fly up at once toward the ceiling, healthy and glowing a bright green. Hermione nodded in satisfaction. Okay, what next? There was a long pause. Seriously, you seriously have to say oogly boogly with the duration of the U, A, and E sounds having a ratio of 3 to 1 to 2, or the bat won't glow. Why, for the love of all that is sacred, why? Why not? A-A-A-A-A-A-A-A-R-R-R-R-R-G-H-H-H-H. Thud, thud, thud. Harry had thought about the nature of magic for a while, and then designed a series of experiments based on the premise that virtually everything wizards believed about magic was wrong. You couldn't really need to say, Wingardium Leviosa, in exactly the right way in order to levitate something, because, come on, Wingardium Leviosa. The universe was going to check that you said, Wingardium Leviosa, in exactly the right way, and otherwise it wouldn't make the quill float. No, obviously no, once you thought about it seriously. Someone, quite possibly an actual preschool child, but at any rate some English-speaking magic user, who thought that Wingardium Leviosa sounded all flyish and floaty, had originally spoken those words while casting the spell for the first time. And then told everyone else it was necessary. But Harry had reasoned, it didn't have to be that way, it wasn't built into the universe, it was built into you. There was an old story passed down among scientists, a cautionary tale, the story of Blondlot and the N-rays. Shortly after the discovery of X-rays, an eminent French physicist named Prosper René Blondlot, who had been first to measure the speed of radio waves and show that they propagated at the speed of light, had announced the discovery of an amazing new phenomenon, N-rays, which would induce a faint brightening of a screen. You had to look hard to see it, but it was there. N-rays had all sorts of interesting properties. They were bent by aluminium and could be focused by an aluminium prism into striking a treated thread of cadmium sulfide, which would then glow faintly in the dark. Soon dozens of other scientists had confirmed Blondlot's results, especially in France. But there were still other scientists, in England and Germany, who said they weren't quite sure they could see that faint glow. Blondlot had said they were probably setting up the machinery wrong. One day Blondlot had given a demonstration of N-rays. The lights had turned out, and his assistant had called off the brightening and darkening as Blondlot performed his manipulations. It had been a normal demonstration, all the results going as expected. Even though an American scientist named Robert Wood had quietly stolen the aluminium prism from the center of Blondlot's mechanism. And that had been the end of N-rays. Reality, Philip K. Dick had once said, is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Blondlot's sin had been obvious in retrospect. He shouldn't have told his assistant what he was doing. Blondlot should have made sure the assistant didn't know what was being tried or when it was being tried, before asking him to describe the screen's brightness. It could have been that simple. Nowadays it was called blinding, and it was one of the things modern scientists took for granted. If you were doing a psychology experiment to see whether people got angrier when they were hit over the head with red truncheons than with green truncheons, you didn't get to look at the subjects yourself and decide how angry they were. You would snap photos of them after they'd been hit with the truncheon, and send the photos off to a panel of raters, who would rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how angry each person looked, obviously without knowing what color of truncheon they'd been hit with. Indeed, there was no good reason to tell the raters what the experiment was about, at all. You certainly wouldn't tell the experimental subjects that you thought they ought to be angrier when hit by red truncheons. You'd just offer them £20, lure them into a test room, hit them with a truncheon, color randomly assigned of course, and snap the photo. In fact, the truncheon hitting and photo snapping would be done by an assistant who hadn't been told about the hypothesis, so he couldn't look expectant, hit harder, or snap the photo at just the right time. Blondlot had destroyed his reputation with the sort of mistake that would get a failing grade and probably derisive laughter from the TA. In a first-year undergraduate course on experimental design. In 1991. But this had been a bit longer ago, in 1904, and so it had taken months before Robert Wood had formulated the obvious alternative hypothesis and figured out how to test it, and dozens of other scientists had been sucked in. More than 2 centuries after science had gotten started. That late in scientific history, it still hadn't been obvious. Which made it entirely plausible that in the tiny wizarding world, where science didn't seem much known at all, no one had ever tried the first, the simplest, the most obvious thing that any modern scientist would think to check. The books were full of complicated instructions for all the things you had to do exactly right in order to cast a spell. And Harry had hypothesized the process of obeying those instructions, of checking that you were following them correctly, probably did do something. It forced you to concentrate on the spell. Being told to just wave your wand and which probably wouldn't work as well. And once you believed the spell was supposed to work a certain way, once you had practiced it that way, you might not be able to convince yourself that it could work any other way. If you did the simple but wrong thing, and tried to test alternative forms yourself. But what if you didn't know what the original spell had been like? What if you gave Hermione a list of spells she hadn't studied yet, taken from a book of silly prank spells in the Hogwarts library, and some of those spells had the correct and original instructions, while others had one changed gesture, one changed word? What if you kept the instructions constant, but told her that a spell supposed to create a red worm was supposed to create a blue worm instead? Well, in that case, it had turned out. Harry was having trouble believing his results here. If you told Hermione to say, oogly boogly, with the vowel durations in the ratio of 3 to 1 to 1, instead of the correct ratio of 3 to 1 to 2, you still got the bat, but it wouldn't glow anymore. Not that belief was irrelevant here. Not that only the words and wand movements mattered. If you gave Hermione completely incorrect information about what a spell was supposed to do, it would stop working. If you didn't tell her at all what the spell was supposed to do, it would stop working. If she knew in very vague terms what the spell was supposed to do, or she was only partially wrong, then the spell would work as originally described in the book, not the way she'd been told it should. Harry was, at this moment, literally banging his head against the brick wall. Not hard. He didn't want to damage his precious brains. But if he didn't have some outlet for his frustration, he would spontaneously catch on fire. Thud, thud, thud. It seemed the universe actually did want you to say, Wingardium Leviosa, and it wanted you to say it in a certain exact way, and it didn't care what you thought the pronunciation should be any more than it cared how you felt about gravity. Whyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyyy Hermione had not been okay with sitting around obediently following Harry's instructions without being told why. So Harry had explained to her what they were testing. Harry had explained why they were testing it. Harry had explained why probably no wizard had tried it before them. Harry had explained that he was actually fairly confident of his prediction. Because, Harry had said, there was no way that the universe actually wanted you to say, Wingardium Leviosa. Hermione had pointed out that this was not what her book said. Hermione had asked if Harry really thought he was smarter, at 11 years old and just over a month into his Hogwarts education, than all the other wizards in the world who disagreed with him. Harry had said the following exact words. Of course. Now Harry was staring at the red brick directly in front of him and contemplating how hard he would have to hit his head in order to give himself a concussion that would interfere with long-term memory formation and prevent him from remembering this later. Hermione wasn't laughing, but he could feel her intent to laugh radiating out from behind him like a dreadful pressure on his skin, sort of like knowing you were being stalked by a serial killer, only worse. Say it, Harry said. I wasn't going to, said the kindly voice of Hermione Granger. It didn't seem nice. Just get it over with, said Harry. Okay, so you gave me this whole long lecture about how hard it was to do basic science and how we might need to stay on the problem for 35 years, and then you went and expected us to make the greatest discovery in the history of magic in the first hour we were working together. You didn't just hope, you really expected it. You're silly. Thank you. Now, I've read all the books you gave me and I still don't know what to call that. Overconfidence. Planning fallacy. Super duper Lake Wobegon effect. They'll have to name it after you. Harry Bias. All right. But it is cute. It's such a boy thing to do. Drop dead. Ah, you say the most romantic things. Thud, thud, thud. So what's next? Said Hermione. Harry rested his head against the bricks. His forehead was starting to hurt where he'd been banging it. Nothing. I have to go back and design different experiments. Over the last month, Harry had carefully worked out, in advance, a course of experimentation for them that would have lasted until December. It would have been a great set of experiments if the very first test had not falsified the basic premise. Harry could not believe he had been this dumb. Let me correct myself, said Harry. I need to design one new experiment. I'll let you know when we've got it, and we'll do it, and then I'll design the next one. How does that sound? It sounds like someone wasted a whole lot of effort. Thud. Ow. He'd done that a bit harder than he'd planned. So, said Hermione. She was leaning back in her chair and the smug look was back on her face. What did we discover today? I discovered, said Harry through gritted teeth, that when it comes to doing truly basic research on a genuinely confusing problem where you have no clue what's going on, my books on scientific methodology aren't worth crap. Language, Mr. Potter. Some of us are innocent young girls. Fine. But if my books were worth a carp, that's a kind of fish, not anything bad, they would have given me the following important piece of advice: when there's a confusing problem and you're just starting out and you have a falsifiable hypothesis, go test it. Find some simple, easy way of doing a basic check and do it right away. Don't worry about designing an elaborate course of experiments that would make a grant proposal look impressive to a funding agency. Just check as fast as possible whether your ideas are false before you start investing huge amounts of effort in them. How does that sound for a moral? Okay, said Hermione. But I was also hoping for something like, Hermione's books aren't worthless. They're written by wise old wizards who know way more about magic than I do. I should pay attention to what Hermione's books say. Can we have that moral too? Harry's jaw seemed to be clenched too tightly to let any words out, so he just nodded. Great, Hermione said. I liked this experiment. We learned a lot from it and it only took me an hour or so. In the dungeons of Slytherin. An unused classroom lit with eerie green light, much brighter this time and coming from a small crystal globe with a temporary enchantment, but eerie green light nonetheless, casting strange shadows from the dusty desks. Two boy-sized figures in cowled gray cloaks, no masks, had entered in silence, and sat down in two chairs opposite the same desk. It was the second meeting of the Bayesian conspiracy. Draco Malfoy hadn't been sure if he should look forward to it or not. Harry Potter, judging by the expression on his face, didn't seem to have any doubts on the appropriate mood. Harry Potter looked like he was ready to kill someone. Hermione Granger, said Harry Potter, just as Draco was opening his mouth. Don't ask. He couldn't have gone on another date, could he? Thought Draco, but that didn't make any sense. Harry, said Draco, I'm sorry but I have to ask this anyway, did you really order the Mudblood girl an expensive moleskin pouch for her birthday? Yes, I did. You've already worked out why, of course. Draco reached up and raked fingers through his hair in frustration, his cowl brushing the back of his hand. He hadn't been quite sure why, but now he couldn't say so. And Slytherin knew he was courting Harry Potter, he'd made it obvious enough in defense class. Harry, said Draco, people know I'm friends with you, they don't know about the conspiracy of course, but they know we're friends, and it makes me look bad when you do that sort of thing. Harry Potter's face tightened. Anyone in Slytherin who can't understand the concept of acting nice toward people you don't actually like should be ground up and fed to pet snakes. There are a lot of people in Slytherin who don't, Draco said, his voice serious. Most people are stupid, and you have to look good in front of them anyway. Harry Potter had to understand that if he ever wanted to get anywhere in life. What do you care what other people think? Are you really going to live your life needing to explain everything you do to the dumbest idiots in Slytherin, letting them judge you? I'm sorry, Draco, but I'm not lowering my cunning plots to the level of what the dumbest Slytherins can understand, just because it might make you look bad otherwise. Not even your friendship is worth that. It would take all the fun out of life. Tell me you haven't ever thought the same thing when someone in Slytherin is being too stupid to breathe, that it's beneath the dignity of a Malfoy to have to pander to them. Draco genuinely hadn't. Ever. Pandering to idiots was like breathing, you did it without thinking about it. Harry, Draco said at last. Just doing whatever you want, without worrying about how it looks, isn't smart. The Dark Lord worried about how he looked. He was feared and hated, and he knew exactly what sort of fear and hate he wanted to create. Everyone has to worry about what other people think. The cowled figure shrugged. Perhaps. Remind me sometime to tell you about something called Ash's conformity experiment, you might find it quite amusing. For now I'll just note that it's dangerous to worry about what other people think on instinct, because you actually care, not as a matter of cold-blooded calculation. Remember, I was beaten and bullied by older Slytherins for 15 minutes, and afterward I stood up and graciously forgave them. Just like the good and virtuous boy who lived ought to do. But my cold-blooded calculations, Draco, tell me that I have no use for the dumbest idiots in Slytherin, since I don't own a pet snake. So I have no reason to care what they think about how I conduct my duel with Hermione Granger. Draco did not clench his fists in frustration. She's just some mudblood, Draco said, keeping his voice calm, rather than shouting. If you don't like her, push her down the stairs. Ravenclaw would know. Have Pansy Parkinson push her down the stairs. You wouldn't even have to manipulate her, offer her a sickle and she'd do it. I would know. Hermione beat me in a book reading contest, she's getting better grades than me, I have to defeat her with my brain or it doesn't count. She's just a mudblood. Why do you respect her that much? She's a power among Ravenclaws. Why do you care what some powerless idiot in Slytherin thinks? It's called politics. And if you can't play it, you can't have power. Walking on the moon is power. Being a great wizard is power. There are kinds of power that don't require me to spend the rest of my life pandering to morons. Both of them stopped, and, in almost perfect unison, began taking deep breaths to calm themselves. Sorry, Harry Potter said after a few moments, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sorry, Draco. You've got a lot of political power and it makes sense for you to keep it. You should be calculating what Slytherin thinks. It's an important game and I shouldn't have insulted it. But you can't ask me to lower the level of my game in Ravenclaw just so that you don't look bad by associating with me. Tell Slytherin you're gritting your teeth while you pretend to be my friend. That was exactly what Draco had told Slytherin, and he still wasn't sure whether it was true. Anyway, Draco said, speaking of your image, I'm afraid I've got some bad news. Rita Skeeter heard some of the stories about you and she's been asking questions. Harry Potter raised his eyebrows. Who? She writes for the Daily Prophet, Draco said. He tried to keep the worry out of his voice. The Daily Prophet was one of Father's primary tools, he used it like a wizard's wand. That's the newspaper people actually pay attention to. Rita Skeeter writes about celebrities, and as she puts it, uses her quill to puncture their overinflated reputations. If she can't find any rumors about you, she'll just make up her own. I see, said Harry Potter. His green-lit face looked very thoughtful beneath the cowl. Draco hesitated before saying what he had to say next. By now someone had certainly reported to Father that he was courting Harry Potter, and Father would also know that Draco hadn't written home about it, and Father would understand that Draco didn't think he could actually keep it a secret, which sent a clear message that Draco was practicing his own game now but still on Father's side, since if Draco had been tempted away, he would have been sending false reports. It followed that Father had probably anticipated what Draco was about to say next. Playing the game with Father for real was a rather unnerving sensation. Even if they were on the same side. It was, on the one hand, exhilarating, but Draco also knew that in the end it would turn out that Father had played the game better. There was no other way it could possibly go. Harry, Draco finally said. This isn't a suggestion. This isn't my advice. Just the way it is. My father could almost certainly quash that article. But it would cost you. That Father had been expecting Draco to tell Harry Potter exactly that was not something Draco said out loud. Harry Potter would work it out on his own, or not. But instead Harry Potter shook his head, smiling beneath the cowl. I have no intention of trying to quash Rita Skeeter. Draco didn't even try to keep the incredulity out of his voice. You can't tell me you don't care what the newspaper says about you. I care less than you might think, said Harry Potter. But I have my own ways of dealing with the likes of Skeeter. I don't need Lucius's help. A worried look came over Draco's face before he could stop it. Whatever Harry Potter was about to do next, it would be something Father wasn't expecting, and Draco was feeling very nervous about where that might lead. Draco also realized that his hair was getting sweaty underneath the cowl. He'd never actually worn one of those before, and hadn't realized that the Death Eater's cloaks probably had things like cooling charms. Harry Potter wiped some sweat from his forehead again, grimaced, took out his wand, pointed it upward, took a deep breath, and said, Frigidero. Moments later Draco felt the cold draft. Frigidero, 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 Frigidero. Then Harry Potter lowered the wand, though his hand seemed a bit shaky, and put it back into his robes. The whole room seemed perceptibly cooler. Draco could have done that too, but still, not bad. So, Draco said, science. You're going to tell me about blood. We're going to find out about blood, Harry Potter said. By doing experiments. All right, Draco said. What sort of experiments? Harry Potter smiled evilly beneath his cowl, and said, you tell me. Draco had heard of something called the Socratic method, which was teaching by asking questions, named after an ancient philosopher who had been too smart to be a real muggle and hence had been a disguised pureblood wizard. One of his tutors had used Socratic teaching a lot. It had been annoying but effective. Then there was the Potter method, which was insane. To be fair, Draco had to admit that Harry Potter had tried the Socratic method first and it hadn't been working too well. Harry Potter had asked how Draco would go about disproving the blood purist hypothesis that wizards couldn't do the neat stuff now that they'd done 8 centuries ago because they had interbred with muggleborns and squibs. Draco had said that he did not understand how Harry Potter could sit there with a straight face and claim this was not a trap. Harry Potter had replied, still with a straight face, that if it was a trap it would have been so pathetically obvious that he ought to be ground up and fed to pet snakes, but it was not a trap, it was simply a rule of how scientists operated that you had to try to disprove your own theories, and if you made an honest effort and failed, that was victory. Draco had tried to point out the staggering stupidity of this by suggesting that the key to surviving a duel was to cast Avada Kedavra on your own foot and miss. Harry Potter had nodded. Draco had shaken his head. Harry Potter had then presented the idea that scientists watched ideas fight to see which ones won, and you couldn't fight without an opponent, so Draco needed to figure out opponents for the blood purist hypothesis to fight so that blood purism could win, which Draco understood a little better even though Harry Potter had said it with a rather distasteful look. Like, it was clear that if blood purism was the way the world really was, then the sky just had to be blue, and if some other theory was true, the sky just had to be green, and nobody had seen the sky yet, and then you went outside and looked and the blood purists won, and after this had happened 6 times in a row, people would start noticing the trend. Harry Potter had then proceeded to claim that all the opponents Draco was inventing were too weak, so Blood Purism wouldn't get credit for defeating them because the battle wouldn't be impressive enough. Draco had understood that too. Wizards have gotten weaker because house elves are stealing our magic hadn't sounded impressive to him either. Though Harry Potter had said that one at least was testable, in that they could try to check if house elves had gotten stronger over time, and even draw a picture representing the increasing strength of house elves and another picture representing the decreasing strength of wizards, and if the two pictures matched that would point to the house elves, all said in such completely serious tones that Draco had felt an impulse to ask Dobby a few pointed questions under Veritaserum before snapping out of it. And Harry Potter had finally said that Draco couldn't fix the battle. Scientists weren't dumb. It would be obvious if you fixed the battle. It had to be a real fight between two different theories that might both really be true, with a test that only the true hypothesis would win, something that actually would come out different ways depending on which hypothesis was actually correct, and there would be experienced scientists watching to make sure that was exactly what happened. Harry Potter had claimed that he himself just wanted to know how blood really worked and for that he need to see Blood Purism really win, and Draco wasn't going to fool him with theories that were just there to be knocked down. Even having seen the point, Draco hadn't been able to invent any plausible alternatives, as Harry Potter put it, to the idea that wizards were getting less powerful because they were mixing their blood with mud. It was too obviously true. It was then that Harry Potter had said, rather frustrated, that he couldn't imagine Draco was really this bad at considering different viewpoints. Surely there'd been Death Eaters who'd posed as enemies of Blood Purism and had come up with much more plausible sounding arguments against their own side than Draco was offering. If Draco had been trying to pose as a member of Dumbledore's faction, and come up with the house elf hypothesis, he wouldn't have fooled anyone for a second. Draco had been forced to admit this was a point. Hence the Potter method. Please, Dr. Malfoy, whined Harry Potter, why won't you accept my paper? Harry Potter had needed to repeat the phrase, just pretend to be pretending to be a scientist 3 times before Draco had understood. In that moment Draco had realized that there was something deeply wrong with Harry Potter's brain, and anyone who tried legilimency on it would probably never come back out again. Harry Potter had then gone into further and considerable detail. Draco was to pretend to be a Death Eater who was posing as the editor of a scientific journal, Dr. Malfoy, who wanted to reject his enemy Dr. Potter's paper on the heritability of magical ability, and if the Death Eater didn't act like a real scientist he would be revealed as a Death Eater and executed, while Dr. Malfoy was also being watched by his own rivals and needed to appear to reject Dr. Potter's paper for neutral scientific reasons or he would lose his position as journal editor. It was a wonder the Sorting Hat wasn't gibbering madly in St. Mungo's. It was also the most complicated thing anyone had ever asked Draco to pretend, and there was no possible way he could have refused the challenge. Right now they were, as Harry Potter had put it, getting in the mood. I'm afraid, Dr. Potter, that you wrote this in the wrong color of ink, Draco said. Next. Dr. Potter's face did an excellent job of crumpling in despair, and Draco couldn't help but feel a flash of Dr. Malfoy's glee, even though the Death Eater was only pretending to be Dr. Malfoy. This part was fun. He could have done this all day long. Dr. Potter got up from the chair, slumped over in dismay, and trudged off, and turned into Harry Potter, who gave Draco a thumbs up, and then turned back into Dr. Potter again, now approaching with an eager smile. Dr. Potter sat down and presented Dr. Malfoy with a piece of parchment on which was written, on the heritability of magical ability. Dr. J. Potter Evans Veras, Institute for Sufficiently Advanced Science. My observation. Today's wizards can't do things as impressive as what wizards used to do 800 years ago. My conclusion. Wizardkind has become weaker by mixing their blood with muggleborns and squibs. Dr. Malfoy, said Dr. Potter with a hopeful look, I was wondering if the Journal of Irreproducible Results could consider for publication my paper entitled, On the Heritability of Magical Ability. Draco looked at the parchment, smiling while he considered possible rejections. If he was a professor, he would have refused. The essay is too short, so. It's too long, Dr. Potter, said Dr. Malfoy. For a moment there was genuine incredulity on Dr. Potter's face. Ah, said Dr. Potter, how about if I get rid of the separate lines for observations and conclusions, and just put in a therefore? Then it'll be too short. Next. Dr. Potter trudged off. All right, said Harry Potter, you're getting too good at this. 2 more times to practice, and then 3rd time is for real, no interruptions between, I'll just come in straight at you and that time you'll reject the paper based on the actual content. Remember, your scientific rivals are watching. Dr. Potter's next paper was perfect in every way, a marvel of its kind, but unfortunately had to be rejected because Dr. Malfoy's journal was having trouble with the letter E. Dr. Potter offered to rewrite it without those words, and Dr. Malfoy explained that it was really more of a vowel problem. The paper after that was rejected because it was Tuesday. It was, in fact, Saturday. Dr. Potter tried to point this out and was told, next. Draco was starting to understand why Snape had used his hold over Dumbledore just to get a position that let him be awful to students. And then, Dr. Potter was approaching with a superior smirk on his face. "This is my latest paper, on the heritability of magical ability," Dr. Potter stated confidently, and thrust out the parchment. "I have decided to allow your journal to publish it, and have prepared it in perfect accordance with your guidelines so that you may publish it quickly." The Death Eater decided to track down and kill Dr. Potter after his mission was done. Dr. Malfoy kept a polite smile on his face, since his rivals were watching, and said. The pause stretched, with Dr. Potter looking at him impatiently. Quote. "Let me look at that, please." Dr. Malfoy took the parchment and perused it carefully. The Death Eater was starting to get nervous about the fact that he wasn't a real scientist, and Draco was trying to remember how to talk like Harry Potter. "You, need to consider other possible explanations for your, observation, besides just this one." "Really?" interrupted Dr. Potter. "Like what, exactly? House elves are stealing our magic." "My data admit of only one possible conclusion, Dr. Malfoy. There are no other plausible hypotheses." Draco was trying furiously to order his brain to think, what would he say if he was posing as a member of Dumbledore's faction? What did they claim was the explanation for Wizardkin's decline? Draco had never bothered to actually ask that. "If you can't think of any other way to explain my data, you'll have to publish my paper, Dr. Malfoy." It was the sneer on Dr. Potter's face that did it. "Oh yeah," snapped Dr. Malfoy. "How do you know that magic itself isn't fading away?" Time stopped. Draco and Harry Potter exchanged looks of appalled horror. Then Harry Potter spat something that was probably an extremely bad word if you'd been raised by muggles. "I didn't think of that," said Harry Potter. "And I should have. The magic goes away. Damn, damn, damn." The alarm in Harry Potter's voice was contagious. Without even thinking about it, Draco's hand went into his robes and clutched at his wand. He'd thought the House of Malfoy was safe, so long as you only married into families that could trace their bloodlines back 4 generations you were supposed to be safe. It had never occurred to him before that there might be nothing anyone could do to stop the end of magic. "Harry, what do we do?" Draco's voice was rising in panic. "What do we do?" "Let me think." After a few moments, Harry grabbed from a nearby desk the same quill and roll of parchment he'd used to write his pretend paper, and started scribbling something. "We'll figure it out," Harry said, his voice tight. "If magic is fading out of the world, we'll figure out how fast it's fading and how much time we have left to do something, and then we'll figure out why it's fading, and then we'll do something about it." "Draco, have wizarding powers been declining at a steady rate, or have there been sudden drops?" I don't know. You told me that no one had matched the 4 founders of Hogwarts. So it's been going on for at least 8 centuries, then. You can't remember hearing anything about the problem suddenly appearing 5 centuries ago or anything like that." Draco was trying frantically to think. "I always heard that nobody was as good as Merlin, and then after that nobody was as good as the founders of Hogwarts." "All right," Harry said. He was still scribbling. "Because 3 centuries ago is when Muggles started to not believe in magic, which I thought might have something to do with it. And about a century and a half ago was when Muggles began using a kind of technology that stops working around magic, and I was wondering if it might also go the other way around." Draco exploded out of his chair, so angry he could hardly even speak. "It's the Muggles." "Damn it," roared Harry. "Weren't you even listening to yourself? It's been going on for 8 centuries at least, and the Muggles weren't doing anything interesting then. We have to figure out the real truth. The Muggles might have something to do with this, but if they don't and you go blaming everything on them and that stops us from figuring out what's really going on, then one day you're going to wake up in the morning and find out that your wand is just a stick of wood." Draco's breath stopped in his throat. His father often said our wands will break in our hands in his speeches, but Draco had never really thought before about what that meant. It wasn't going to happen to him after all. And now suddenly it seemed very real. Just a stick of wood. Draco could imagine just what it would be like to take out his wand and try to cast a spell and find that nothing was happening. That could happen to everyone. There would be no more wizards, no more magic, ever. Just Muggles who had a few legends about what their ancestors had been able to do. Some of the Muggles would be called Malfoy, and that would be all that was left of the name. For the first time in his life, Draco realized why there were Death Eaters. He'd always taken for granted that becoming a Death Eater was something you did when you grew up. Now Draco understood. He knew why Father and Father's friends had sworn to give their lives to prevent the nightmare from coming to pass. There were things you couldn't just stand by and watch happen. But what if it was going to happen anyway? What if all the sacrifices, all the friends they'd lost to Dumbledore, the family they'd lost, what if it had all been for nothing? "Magic can't be fading away," Draco said. His voice was breaking. "It wouldn't be fair." Harry stopped scribbling and looked up. His face had an angry expression. "Your father never told you that life isn't fair." Father had said that every single time Draco used the word. But, it's too awful to believe that." Draco, let me introduce you to something I call the Litany of Tarski. It changes every time you use it. On this occasion it runs like so: if magic is fading out of the world, I want to believe that magic is fading out of the world. If magic is not fading out of the world, I want not to believe that magic is fading out of the world. Let me not become attached to beliefs I may not want. If we're living in a world where magic is fading, that's what we have to believe. We have to know what's coming, so we can stop it, or in the very worst case, be prepared to do what we can in the time we have left. Not believing it won't stop it from happening. So the only question we have to ask is whether magic is actually fading, and if that's the world we live in, then that's what we want to believe. Litany of Gendlin, what's true is already so, owning up to it doesn't make it worse. Got that, Draco? I'm going to make you memorize it later. It's something you repeat to yourself anytime you start wondering if it's a good idea to believe something that isn't actually true. In fact, I want you to say it right now. What's true is already so, owning up to it doesn't make it worse. Say it. What's true is already so, repeated Draco, his voice trembling, owning up to it doesn't make it worse. If magic is fading, I want to believe that magic is fading. If magic is not fading, I want not to believe that magic is fading. Say it. Draco repeated back the words, the sickness churning in his stomach. Good, Harry said. Remember, it might not be happening, and then you won't have to believe it, either. First we just want to know what's actually going on, which world we actually live in. Harry turned back to his work, scribbled some more, and then turned the parchment so Draco could see it. Draco leaned over the desk and Harry brought the green light closer. Observation. Wizardry isn't as powerful now as it was when Hogwarts was founded. Hypotheses. 1. Magic itself is fading. 2. Wizards are interbreeding with muggles and squibs. 3. Knowledge to cast powerful spells is being lost. 4. Wizards are eating the wrong foods as children, or something else besides blood is making them grow up weaker. 5. Muggle technology is interfering with magic. Since 800 years ago. 6. Stronger wizards are having fewer children. Draco equals only child. Check if 3 powerful wizards, Quirrell, Dumbledore, Darklord, had any children. Tests. All right, Harry said. His breathing sounded a little calmer. Now when you're dealing with a confusing problem and you have no idea what's going on, the smart thing to do is figure out some really simple tests, things you can look at right away. We need fast tests that distinguish between these hypotheses. Observations that would come out a different way for at least one of them compared to all the other ones. Draco stared at the list in shock. He was suddenly realizing that he knew an awful lot of purebloods who were only children. Himself, Vincent, Gregory, practically everyone. The 2 most powerful wizards everyone talked about were Dumbledore and the Dark Lord, and neither had any children, just like Harry had suspected. It's going to be really hard to distinguish between 2 and 6, Harry said. It's in the blood either way. You'd have to try and track the decline of wizardry and compare that to how many kids different wizards were having and measure the abilities of muggleborns compared to purebloods. Harry's fingers were tapping nervously on the desk. Let's just lump 6 in with 2 and call them the blood hypothesis for now. 4 is unlikely because then everyone would notice a sudden drop when the wizards switched to new foods. It's hard to see what would have changed steadily over 800 years. 5 is unlikely for the same reason, no sudden drop. Muggles weren't doing anything 800 years back. 4 looks like 2 and 5 looks like 1 anyway. So mainly we should be trying to distinguish between 1, 2, and 3. Harry turned the parchment to himself, drew an ellipse around those 3 numbers, turned it back. Magic is fading, blood is weakening, knowledge is disappearing. What test comes out differently depending on which of those is true? What could we see that would mean any one of these was false? I don't know, blurted Draco. Why are you asking me? You're the scientist. Draco, Harry said, a note of pleading desperation in his voice, I only know what Muggle scientists know. You grew up in the wizarding world, I didn't. You know more magic than I do and you know more about magic than I do and you thought of this whole idea in the first place, so start thinking like a scientist and solve this. Draco swallowed hard and stared at the paper. Magic is fading. Wizards are interbreeding with muggles. Knowledge is being lost. What does the world look like if magic is fading? Said Harry Potter. You know more about magic, you should be the one guessing, not me. Imagine you're telling a story about it, what happens in the story? Draco imagined it. Charms that used to work stop working. Wizards wake up and find that their wands are sticks of wood. What does the world look like if the wizarding blood gets weaker? People can't do things their ancestors could do. What does the world look like if knowledge is being lost? People don't know how to cast the charms in the first place. Said Draco. He stopped, surprised at himself. That's a test, isn't it? Harry nodded decisively. That's one. He wrote it down on the parchment under tests. A. Are there spells we know but can't cast, 1 or 2, or are the lost spells no longer known, 3? So that distinguishes between 1 and 2 on the one hand, and 3 on the other hand, said Harry. Now we need some way to distinguish between 1 and 2. Magic fading, blood weakening, how could we tell the difference? What kind of charms did students use to cast in their first year at Hogwarts? Said Draco. If they used to be able to cast much more powerful charms, the blood was stronger. Harry Potter shook his head. Or magic itself was stronger. We have to figure out some way of telling the difference. Harry stood up from his chair, began pacing nervously through the classroom. No, wait, that might still work. Suppose different spells use up different amounts of magical energy. Then if the ambient magic weakened, the powerful spells would die first, but the spells everyone learns in their first year would stay the same. Harry's nervous pacing sped up. It's not a very good test, it's more about powerful wizardry being lost versus all wizardry being lost. Someone's blood could be too weak for powerful wizardry but strong enough for easy spells. Draco, do you know if more powerful wizards within a single era, like powerful wizards from just this century, are more powerful as children? If the Dark Lord had cast the cooling charm when he was 11, could he have frozen the whole room? Draco's face screwed up as he tried to recollect. I can't remember hearing anything about the Dark Lord, but I think Dumbledore's supposed to have done something amazing on his transfiguration OWLs in 5th year. I think other powerful wizards were good in Hogwarts too. Harry scowled, still pacing. They could just be studying hard. Still, if first-year students learned the same spells and seemed about as powerful then as now, we could call that weak evidence favoring 1/2. Wait, hold on. Harry stopped where he stood. I have another test that might distinguish between 1 and 2. It would take a while to explain, it uses some things that scientists know about blood and inheritance, but it's an easy question to ask. And if we combine my test and your test and they both come out the same way, that's a strong hint at the answer. Harry almost ran back to the desk, took the parchment and wrote. B. Did ancient first-year students cast the same sort of spells, with the same power, as now? Weak evidence for 1/2, but blood could also be losing powerful wizardry only. C. Additional test that distinguishes 1 and 2 using scientific knowledge of blood, we'll explain later. Okay, said Harry, we can at least try to tell the difference between 1 and 2 and 3, so let's go with this right away. We can figure out more tests after we do the ones we already have. Now it's going to look a little odd if Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter go around asking questions together, so here's my idea. You'll go through Hogwarts and find old portraits and ask them about what spells they learned to cast during their first years. They're portraits so they won't know there's anything odd about Draco Malfoy doing that. I'll ask recent portraits and living people about spells we know but can't cast. No one will notice anything unusual if Harry Potter asks weird questions. And I'll have to do complicated research about forgotten spells, so I want you to be the one to gather the data I need for my own scientific question. It's a simple question and you should be able to find the answer by asking portraits. You might want to write this down. Ready? Draco sat down again and scrabbled in his book bag for parchment and quill. When it was laid down on the desk, Draco looked up, face determined. Go ahead. Find portraits who knew a married squib couple. Don't make that face, Draco, it's important information. Just ask recent portraits who are Gryffindors or something. Find portraits who knew a married squib couple well enough to know the names of all their children. Write down the name of each child and whether that child was a wizard, a squib, or a muggle. If they don't know whether the child was a squib or a muggle, write down, non-wizard. Write that down for every child the couple had, don't leave any out. If the portrait only knows the name of the wizarding children, not the names of all the children, then don't write down any data from that couple. It's very important that you only bring me data from someone who knows all the children a squib couple had, well enough to know them all by name. Try to get at least 40 names total, if you can, and if you have time for more, even better. Have you got all that? Repeat it, Draco said, when he was done writing, and Harry repeated it. I've got it, Draco said, but why? It has to do with one of the secrets of blood that scientists already discovered. I'll explain when you get back. Let's split up and meet back here in an hour, 6:22 p.m. that should be. Are we ready to go? Draco nodded decisively. It was all very rushed, but he'd long since been taught how to rush. Then go, said Harry Potter and yanked off his cowled cloak and shoved it into his pouch, which began eating it, and, without even waiting for his pouch to finish, spun around and began striding rapidly toward the classroom door, bumping into a desk and almost falling over in his haste. By the time Draco had managed to get his own cloak off and stow it in his book bag, Harry Potter was gone. Draco almost ran out the door.